The ice on Lake Varrun cracked beneath Cole Hardin's left boot with a sound that traveled across 11 miles of frozen water and came back changed. That was the thing about sound on ice in January. It moved differently out here. It bounced off ridgelines and returned to you carrying something it hadn't left with, a deeper register, a kind of warning dressed up as an echo. Cole stopped walking. He planted both feet evenly, shifted his weight to center, and held still for a count of 4. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The crack hadn't widened. Just the lake settling into the cold the way it always did in late January, when the temperature at 6,800 feet dropped low enough to make metal brittle and silence feel like it had mass. He knew this sound. 8 years of walking Lake Varrun in every season had given him the kind of understanding that didn't come from manuals or training modules. It came from repetition, from paying attention when no one else was watching, from choosing to care about things that generated no reward. He knew where the 3 underwater springs fed into the eastern shelf and kept that section a degree or 2 warmer than the surrounding lake bed. He knew which stretch ran nearly 190 feet deep, up near the northern headland where the bedrock dropped away unexpectedly. He knew which color variation in the ice surface meant 8 safe inches beneath his boots and which meant 6. And he knew that 6 was fine for a man his size in January and 4 was not. The crack he'd been monitoring ran 18 feet southeast from a marker he'd flagged in December. He pulled out his notebook, the paper kind, because his phone battery lasted 40 minutes at -18, and he'd learned that lesson the hard way in his second winter up here, and recorded the crack's current length against the prior measurement. Stable. He noted the date, the air temperature, the approximate snow depth above the fault line, and moved on. Cole Hardin was 38 years old and had been stationed at the Kootenai National Forest Lake Assessment Division for 8 of them. He was responsible for 11 lakes spread across a territory that most people in the continental United States had never heard of, and he walked each one with the same attention he'd learned from a wildlife biology professor at the University of Montana who used to say that wilderness didn't reveal itself to the impatient. It showed itself to people who'd learned to wait for it. The professor had also warned him that the job would make him strange. He hadn't been wrong about that either. Cole's ex-wife Diane had used other words. Obsessive was the one that came up most often, then withdrawn, then unavailable, the last delivered by her attorney in a document that cost Cole $11,000 to respond to, and that ultimately produced a custody arrangement giving him Nora every other weekend, weather permitting. Nora was 9 years old. She had her mother's dark hair and Cole's habit of going very quiet when she was thinking hard about something. She visited him at the ranger station cabin 14 miles from the lake's southern access road, and she called every night at 7:30, and on the weekends when road conditions made the drive impossible, Cole converted the specific weight of her absence into extra miles on the ice. The pressure crack was stable. He moved north along the western shore, toward the section of lake that had been generating mildly unusual readings since the previous week, when he'd first noticed the discoloration. He'd seen it on a Thursday afternoon, almost by accident. The January sun had been hitting the surface at a low angle, the kind of oblique winter light that stripped away surface glare and revealed the ice for what it actually was rather than what it appeared to be. And there, maybe 40 feet off the western shore and slightly north of center, the ice had looked different. Not gray, not darker. More like the surface there was translucent in a way the surrounding area wasn't, as if something beneath it was generating just enough warmth to slow the freeze at that particular spot. He'd taken photographs and GPS coordinates and gone home and thought about it for 3 days before going back with his auger. What he'd found when he drilled the grid of test holes that following Monday had not been reassuring. The ice in the discolored section was consistently thinner than the surrounding surface. Not dramatically, 2 to 3 inches over a roughly 12-foot radius, with the differential increasing toward a center point that sat approximately 40 feet from the western bank. The center hole measured 7 inches thick where the surrounding lake was averaging 12. And when Cole had pressed his bare palm flat against the ice at that center point, stripping off his right glove despite the temperature being -19, he'd felt something he'd only ever associated with geological thermal activity. The ice was warmer. Not dramatically warmer. Not like pressing your hand against a radiator. But measurably, specifically warmer than the ice 6 feet to his left, and in a pattern too regular and too consistent to be a quirk of the snow depth or a shadow effect from the ridgeline. He'd lowered his underwater camera through the center hole on that first visit. The cord ran to 25 feet before the image on the small monitor showed him the lake bottom, silty and unremarkable, and then to 28 feet, where the camera's light found something that was neither rock nor sediment nor submerged timber. Concrete. Cole had sat on the ice in the January cold and stared at the image on the monitor for a long time. The camera angle was poor. The image showed maybe 6 square feet of concrete surface, flat and horizontal, covered in the algae and sediment of long immersion. But it was concrete. He was certain of it. He'd pressed the zoom function and looked at the texture, at the aggregate visible in places where the algae hadn't fully colonized, and there was no geological or botanical explanation for what he was looking at. He photographed the monitor image and drove to the district office in Libby the following morning. District Manager Gerald Foss had been managing this part of the Kootenai for 14 years. He was a careful man, methodical in the way of people who'd learned early that the safest administrative position was usually the one that required no action. He received Cole's report, his photographs, his GPS coordinates, his ice depth measurements, and his thermal differential calculations with the expression of a man being presented with a minor plumbing concern on a property he didn't plan to sell. Concrete, Foss said. Cole waited. At 28 feet. That's what the camera shows, yes. Foss spread the photographs across his desk and looked at them without touching them. Old industrial foundations. Logging infrastructure. Equipment that went through the ice decades ago. There have been structures in these lakes since before this forest was a forest, Cole. The thermal differential suggests something is generating warmth below the surface. That's not consistent with inert foundation material. Residual heat conductivity from the underlying geology. Could be a boulder formation running hot beneath the lake bed. The concrete's just sitting on it. Cole looked at him for a moment. I'd like authorization for an underwater assessment. Foss leaned back. It's January. I have a dry suit and winter diving experience. In this specific lake? Twice. Ice safety assessments in the southern section. Visibility in winter is better than summer because there's no thermal mixing. Foss pressed his fingers together in the particular configuration he used when he was about to say no. We don't have budget for an unauthorized solo dive operation in a backcountry lake in the middle of winter. Submit a formal request. I'll review it in February, and we can discuss a spring assessment when the ice breaks. Cole submitted the request that afternoon and drove back to the lake the following morning before sunrise. He hadn't done anything that violated the letter of what Foss had told him. He hadn't attempted a dive. He'd brought his camera on a longer cord this time, 60 feet, and a more powerful light, and 3 additional auger bits, and he'd spent 4 hours drilling a grid of holes around the original location and photographing what the camera revealed at depth through each one. When he sat in his truck at noon running through the images, he understood that the thermal differential was the least interesting thing he'd found. The concrete wasn't a slab. It had corners. It had edges where vertical surfaces met a horizontal ceiling, visible in 3 of the 41 photographs he'd taken when the camera angle cooperated. He was looking at the roofline of a structure, a building, or something built like a building, at 30 feet of depth in a remote mountain lake in northern Montana, in a location that no geological or archaeological survey he'd ever reviewed had mentioned. The dimensions, as best he could estimate from fragmentary visual information, were approximately 12 feet wide. The structure ran north-south. At the southern end, 2 of the photographs captured what appeared to be a framed opening in the concrete wall. Not an accidental gap. A door frame, with the remains of a hinge visible on the left side. Cole sat in his truck for 40 minutes without starting the engine. Outside, the lake glittered under midday sun with the particular brilliance of ice that has nothing to hide and everything to conceal. He called his colleague Danny Serrano that evening. Danny was stationed at the Flathead National Forest and did more winter diving than anyone Cole knew. He also had the particular quality of being willing to talk through things that would have made most people hang up. Cole described what he'd found. Danny listened without interrupting, which was one of his best qualities. What you're describing sounds like it could be a bunker, Danny said when Cole finished. Cole waited. Or something constructed like one. You know, this region had government infrastructure during the Cold War. Communication stations. Weather monitoring posts. some classified installations that were supposedly decommissioned in the late 60s. There's documentation of several dozen federal projects in Lincoln County alone from the late 40s through the mid-50s, most of it partially classified and poorly archived. Under a lake. The lake may have changed. Water levels in these mountain basins shift substantially over decades, especially after the logging era ended and the forest canopy recovered and the evapotranspiration balance shifted. Something built near a shoreline in 1947 might be underwater today. Cole looked at his photographs spread across the station kitchen table. What would you do? Danny paused. What I would do and what you should do are two different things. I know. What would you do? I'd get in the water. Cole borrowed Danny's spare dry suit 3 days later, driving 6 hours round trip to Kalispell to collect it. He told Danny he needed backup gear for winter assessments. And Danny looked at him with the expression of someone choosing silence over a conversation that would create obligations for everyone involved. The suit was 3 inches short in the legs, but the seals were good, and the thermal protection was rated to 32 degrees Fahrenheit water temperature, which was 2 degrees below what Cole expected to find at depth in Varrun in January. He drove out to the lake before sunrise on a Thursday, drilled the center hole wide enough for entry, rigged a safety line to anchors set 8 feet back from the opening, checked his equipment 3 times, and lowered himself into the water. The cold hit his exposed face with the force of something intentional. His dry suit blocked the worst of it, but 34-degree water against skin that has been living at -15 air temperature creates a specific biological alarm that no amount of preparation fully suppresses. Cole breathed through it, regulated his descent, watched his depth gauge rather than the darkness around him. 10 feet, 15, 20. The visibility at depth was extraordinary. Danny had been right about that. Without surface algae and without the thermal mixing that summer created, the water was clear in a way that felt almost unnatural, his light beam cutting straight and clean through 50 feet of water without significant scatter. At 22 feet, he could see the lake bottom in the beam. At 28, he reached out and touched concrete. He hung in the water for a moment. Cold concrete, rough with years of algae growth, the texture of something that had been underwater long enough to become part of the lake's biology rather than a foreign intrusion. He ran his gloved hand along the surface, feeling the corner where the wall met the ceiling, the edge of the roofline he'd seen in the photographs. Then he moved south along the wall, following the structure. 12 feet, 15, 20. The structure was longer than he'd estimated from the surface. His safety line was paying out, and he was approaching its limit when the wall changed beneath his hand. The texture shifted. The smooth concrete gave way to something else, and when he brought his light around, he found them. Hinges. Steel hinges, surface corroded to the orange of old rust, each one the size of his palm, set into the wall at intervals that suggested a door rather than a hatch. Between them, a vertical steel frame outlined a rectangle roughly 5 feet tall and 3 feet wide. At the center of the frame, a wheel mechanism of the type used in industrial pressure applications, flood control equipment, sealed storage vessels. The wheel was corroded but intact. Cole hung in the water in front of a sealed door at the bottom of a frozen lake and breathed. He tried the wheel with both hands. It fought him. The mechanism had been still for a very long time, and the corrosion had worked into the threads with the patience of decades. But it moved. He braced his feet against the wall above the frame and applied steady pressure and felt something shift inside the mechanism, and the wheel turned another quarter rotation before resistance returned. He checked his air. He'd been at depth for 11 minutes, and his reserves weren't sufficient for further mechanical work on this dive. He oriented himself against the safety line, photographed the door from 4 angles, and ascended. He broke the surface into air that felt almost warm in comparison. He pulled himself out, stripped his face seal, and lay on his back on the ice, staring at a sky the color of old pewter. His hands were shaking. Not from cold. Or not entirely. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. He called Nora that night at 7:30. As he did every night, he wasn't with her. She told him about a book she was reading, something about a girl who stowed away on a research vessel and ended up in Antarctica, and she asked if penguins were ever afraid of things. He told her yes. Penguins were afraid of leopard seals and orcas, which were the only real threats they had to worry about. And that being afraid of specific and real dangers was different from being afraid of everything in general. She said, "That makes sense." And then, "Daddy, are you okay? You sound like you're thinking about something." He was quiet for a second. "Just a work problem I'm working through." "Is it dangerous?" He looked out the station window at the darkness and the frozen lake beyond it. Invisible from here, but present the way large things are always present even when you can't see them. "No, baby. Nothing dangerous." After she hung up, he sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and began writing down what he knew. Not for Foss. Not for any report. Just for himself, in the systematic way he approached things that needed to be understood. A concrete structure at 30 feet of depth. North-south orientation. Approximately 12 feet wide, length unknown. A sealed steel door with a wheel mechanism, mid-20th century industrial type. A thermal differential suggesting the structure was generating or conducting warmth from a geological source. A section of lake that had never appeared on any assessment or survey as containing man-made infrastructure. He wrote, "The lake level is not where it was in 1947. He stared at that sentence for a while. He went to bed at 10 and was back on the ice at 6 the following morning with a heavy wrench borrowed from the station maintenance shed, a second safety line, and enough air to attempt the mechanism again. The wheel gave up a further half rotation on the second dive. He came up, warmed for 30 minutes in the truck, and went back down. Another quarter rotation on the third dive, and this time he felt something different beneath his hands. Not just a change in the mechanism's resistance, but a change in the door itself. A faint movement in the frame, like the door was sealed against something on the far side, and the seal was beginning to fail. He drilled a second auger hole the following morning and brought a modified garden cultivator he'd rigged with an extended handle, the kind of improvisation that happened when proper equipment wasn't authorized and waiting for authorization felt physically impossible. He worked the cultivator through the hole and down along the door's base for 90 minutes, clearing the sediment accumulation that was holding the bottom edge in place. On his fifth dive, he pulled the wheel hard with both feet planted against the wall, and the door moved. It ground inward against its frame, and then swung free, and water rushed through the opening into the space beyond, and Cole held the door frame and floated at the threshold for 3 full seconds before following the water inside. The space was not submerged. That was the first thing his light found. He was 30 feet underwater, inside a concrete structure that had been sealed for decades, and the upper portion of the interior was not water. There was air, a pocket of it, trapped by the structure's integrity and by whatever pressure had been inside the room when the door was sealed against the outside world. He estimated 4 feet of vertical air space above the current water line inside the chamber, running the full width of the room. He surfaced inside the air pocket and pushed up his face seal. The smell came first. Mineral, cold, sealed, old. The particular atmosphere of a space that has been breathing its own air for so long, it has developed its own small ecosystem in the dark. But beneath that, something else. Metal and age and a faint chemical note he couldn't immediately place. Something between machine oil and acetone that had been there long enough to lose its sharpness. He turned his light on the chamber. It was 12 feet wide and ran back into the dark for a distance he couldn't determine from the entrance. Metal shelving lined both walls, floor to ceiling, the kind used in military and industrial storage, heavy gauge, the uprights bolted into the concrete. The lower shelves were submerged beneath the water that had entered when he opened the door, and he could see their contents shifting slightly in the currents his entry had created. The upper shelves, 3 rows on each side running above the waterline, were intact, had been dry for long enough that whatever sat on them was still in the condition it had been placed in. Crates. Wooden crates on every shelf, each one roughly the dimensions of a large trunk, stacked 2 deep on each row and stamped on their faces with stenciling that had faded to brown-gray over the decades, but remained legible. He panned his light from left to right and counted what he could see. 14 crates on the left wall above the waterline, 16 on the right, 30 crates above the water, and the submerged shelves below held more. How many more he couldn't determine without better equipment and more time than his air reserves allowed. The stenciling on the nearest crate read U.S. Army Corps of Engineers with a date beneath it, 1947. Below that, in a different typeface, smaller, what appeared to be an alphanumeric designation, he couldn't read clearly at this angle. And below that, in a third language, characters that were not English. He brought his light closer and held it steady until the letters resolved into legibility. German. He was looking at wooden crates in a sealed concrete room 30 feet beneath a frozen Montana lake, marked with U.S. Army stenciling from 1947 and text in German that he could not translate. Cole Hardin was not a man who panicked. 8 years of solo work in remote wilderness had burned most of his panic responses down to a general low-grade alertness that he deployed evenly across situations. But hanging in the air pocket of a submerged Cold War-era concrete bunker, his light moving across 30 visible crates of unknown contents, he felt something moving through him that had no clean name. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something whose dimensions you couldn't yet see. He checked his air. He had 4 minutes before he needed to ascend. He photographed everything the light reached, moving methodically along the near end of the chamber, recording the stenciling, the crate dimensions, the shelf configurations, the water line on the walls that showed how much flooding had occurred since the door failed its seal. He noted a second doorway at the far end of the chamber, this one standing open and leading into darkness beyond the range of his light. He did not go further. He ascended, crossed the ice to his truck, stripped out of the dry suit, and sat in the driver's seat for a long time with the heater running on high. 30 crates above the water. An unknown number below. A room at the bottom of a lake in northern Montana that no survey or assessment had recorded. 1947 stenciling. German text. He thought about what Danny had said about post-war classified installations. About the late 40s and the years immediately after the Second World War ended, and the federal government spent several years quietly moving things, quietly storing things, quietly building structures in remote locations that wouldn't appear on any civilian map. He thought about what kinds of things might have required storage that's secret. In 1947, at 6,800 feet of elevation in a lake that 11 miles across and accessible by a single road that wasn't paved until 1961. He drove to Eureka. Adeline Marsh had been the Lincoln County Historical Records archivist for 31 years before she retired and opened a small shop on the main street that sold topographical maps and local history books, and in the autumn months, pie from apples she grew in her backyard. She was 73 years old and had lived in Eureka her entire life, which meant she possessed the particular knowledge of someone who'd watched a place change across 6 decades and retained everything she'd seen. Cole had met her 4 years earlier while tracking down pre-designation land records for a property dispute in the forest's eastern section. She'd found what he needed in 20 minutes and refused the $20 he'd offered. He'd brought her coffee every time he came to town since then, and she'd told him things about the county's history that weren't written down anywhere because the people who'd known them were gone, and she was the last one who'd thought to ask them while they were still alive. He found her in the back room of her shop with a collection of donated photographs she was cataloging, each one in a paper sleeve labeled in the precise handwriting of someone who understood that nothing stayed organized unless someone made it so. She looked up when he came in. "You look like you found something," she said. "Sit down." He sat and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. She looked at the photographs on his phone with a magnifying glass she kept on the table beside her. She asked 2 questions. What are the GPS coordinates, and what does the German text read as best you could make it out? He gave her the coordinates and spelled out what he'd seen on the nearest crate. She was silent for a moment. Then she went to a large flat cabinet against the wall and began pulling drawers. Cole sat and waited. Through the shop's front window, Eureka's main street was almost empty in the January cold. A truck moved through the single intersection. A woman in a red parka walked quickly toward the post office, her breath visible. He could hear Adeline working in the cabinet, the sound of paper, the dry whisper of old documents being handled carefully. 15 minutes passed. She came back with a folded paper that was clearly an original document, not a copy, yellowed with age and soft at the folds from decades of handling. She spread it on the table. It was a hand-drawn map. The shape of Lake Varrun's shoreline was unmistakable. He'd walked its perimeter enough times to know it the way he knew the layout of the station cabin. But the map was dated in pencil at the lower right corner in handwriting he didn't recognize. September 1947. And the lake on this map was smaller. The western shore in particular sat roughly 45 feet east of where it was now, which meant the western bank he walked today had been below water since some point between 1947 and the present, drowned as the lake expanded with the decades. And on the western shore of the 1947 lake, in the location that now sat 40 feet offshore and 30 feet underwater, a small rectangle had been drawn and labeled in the same faded pencil script. Installation 7. Cole looked at Adeline. She poured water from a kettle she'd put on before pulling the drawers and sat down across from him. Installation 7, she said, and her voice had changed into the register she used when something mattered, was one of 6 storage facilities documented, partially, in records I found 20 years ago during a county history project that ultimately went nowhere. She paused. I found references to it, but the references were fragmentary. They came from 3 different sources: a private letter from a federal land officer to his wife, a purchasing requisition from the Lincoln County hardware store from October of 1947, and an entry in the personal diary of the county assessor at the time, a man named Harold Fent. What did they say? Adeline wrapped both hands around her cup. The letter mentioned construction activity near the western shore of Varrun in the fall of 1947. Federal contractors. Military vehicles. The hardware store records showed a purchase of specialized concrete waterproofing compound in quantities that would have been used for a structure of the dimensions you're describing. And Fent's diary. She paused. Fent wrote that a convoy came through Eureka in early November of that year. He wrote that the vehicles were Army, that they came through in the early morning before most people were up, and that they were carrying crates. A lot of crates, stacked on flatbeds under canvas. Where were they going? Fent didn't know for certain. He wrote that the convoy turned north, toward the lake access road. He wrote that he asked a soldier who'd stopped at the diner for coffee, and the soldier told him it was a geological survey operation. Fent wrote that he didn't believe this, because geological survey teams didn't typically travel at 4 in the morning with armed escorts. Cole looked at the map, at the small rectangle labeled Installation 7. Adeline, what do you think was in those crates? She was quiet for a moment that felt considered rather than hesitant. There was a recovery operation, she said, that took place in the months and years after the end of the Second World War. Not the public one. Not the one that made the newspapers. There was another one, quieter, conducted by people who were less interested in repatriation than in acquisition, or in preservation, or in the particular kind of leverage that comes from controlling access to objects of extreme value that the rest of the world believed had been destroyed. What kind of objects? Some of them were financial instruments. Gold reserves that had been moved during the war by various parties for various reasons. Some of them were documents that certain governments preferred not to have re-examined after the fact. And some of them, she said, looking directly at him, were cultural. Objects, artworks, artifacts, things that had been taken from their original locations during the war and that, by 1947, were officially listed as destroyed or lost. Things that were easier to manage if they stayed lost. Cole sat with this for a moment. The German text on the crates. She nodded. The German text on the crates. Yes. He thought about 30 crates above the waterline. He thought about the submerged shells he hadn't been able to fully see. He thought about a second doorway at the far end of the chamber opening into darkness that his light hadn't reached. How large was Installation 7 supposed to be? I don't know for certain. The construction records are indirect. But the hardware store requisition was substantial. The concrete waterproofing alone suggested a structure larger than what a single room would require. Cole looked at the map again. At the western shore that was now the bottom of the lake. Adeline, if the lake expanded 45 feet westward since 1947, what was the topography of that shoreline? Was it flat? Did it run level? She pulled another drawer and produced a topographical survey from 1939, pre-logging, pre-war. She laid it beside the 1947 hand-drawn map and oriented them against each other. The 1939 shoreline in that section showed a gentle slope dropping from a natural rock shelf about 60 feet west of the 1947 waterline. The shelf itself was roughly level. It extended, if she read the contours correctly, approximately 90 feet north to south before the terrain changed. Cole did the math in his head. 90 feet of level shelf. The structure he'd found was 12 feet wide with a second doorway at the far end. If Installation 7 ran the full length of that shelf, it wasn't one room. It was a corridor with multiple rooms, and he had only opened the first door, and he had only seen the first room. He stood up slowly. I have to go back, he said. Adeline looked at him the way she looked at the old photographs she was cataloging, as if she was trying to decide what the image was really of and not just what it appeared to show. "Cole," she said, "there are things about this I haven't told you yet. Things that I put away 20 years ago because I had no way to verify them and because part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know if they were true. Tell me now." She got up and went back to the cabinet. When she returned this time, she had a folder. Inside the folder were 6 pages of handwritten notes in her own precise script, dated 1998, paper-clipped together, and beneath them a single page that was not her handwriting. This second page was older, typed on a machine whose ribbon had been running low, the letters thin and slightly gray. "This is a copy," she said. "I made it from a document I found in the State Archive in Helena in 1997 during the County History Project. The original is still there, as far as I know. It's classified as a personnel record, and it's accessible to the public because the retention period expired in 1992, but no one had requested it in the intervening years." He read it. It was a memo from a federal land management office in Washington, D.C., dated March 1968. The subject line read, "Decommission Status Review, Lincoln County Installations." The memo listed installation numbers 1 through 6 as decommissioned and cleared between 1959 and 1966. Installation 7, the memo noted, had been sealed in 1952 by order of a department whose name had been redacted from the document. The memo recommended that Installation 7 remain sealed pending a determination of legal jurisdiction that had not been resolved at the time of writing. Cole looked at Adeline. "No one ever went back," she said. He drove back to the lake in the failing afternoon light. The western section was dark when he reached it, the orange marker still visible against the ice. He stood at the edge of the access hole he drilled and looked down through the dark water at a depth his light couldn't reach from up here. 30 crates above the waterline. An unknown number below. A second doorway. A corridor that might run 90 feet. And a 1968 federal memo saying the installation had been sealed by a department whose name someone had thought was important enough to remove from a document that otherwise contained nothing alarming. He thought about the German text on the crates. He thought about Adeline's words. Cultural objects. Artworks. Things that were easier to manage if they stayed lost. His phone battery was at 8%. He'd left the charger in the truck. He stood at the edge of the hole and looked at the ice around it and at the lake stretching away to its dark ridgelines. He had to call someone. That much was clear. What was less clear was who. Foss would request the 14 to 21 business day review window, and the installation would sit in the dark while committees deliberated. Danny was the right person in terms of trust and dive expertise, but what Cole was looking at had moved beyond the scale of something 2 people could manage with a borrowed dry suit and a set of auger bits. He walked back to his truck and sat inside and turned the engine on for heat. His phone buzzed. The battery warning. 6%. He plugged in the charger and waited. While he waited, he pulled out his notebook and wrote, "Installation 7, Lincoln County, MT, sealed 1952 by classified federal order. Legal jurisdiction unresolved as of March 1968. Contents unknown as of present date. Structure likely multi-room. German text on U.S. Army crates from 1947. He stared at what he'd written. Then he wrote one more line. Someone sealed this place and never came back, or never told anyone they did. His phone lit up with a full signal now that it was charging. He looked at the call log. 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize, all from the past 2 hours. No voicemail. He looked at the number. A 202 area code. Washington, D.C. He set the phone down on the dashboard and looked at the lake. He hadn't told anyone about the installation except Danny and Adeline. Danny hadn't known the GPS coordinates. Adeline had the 1947 map with the location marked, but she'd had that for 20 years without anything happening. He picked up the phone and called Danny. Danny answered on the second ring. "You going again today?" "Yeah." And Cole watched the ice through the windshield, the orange marker still visible in the last of the light. "Multiple rooms," he said. "I think I found the first one. There are more." Silence on the other end for a moment. "Cole, I want you to listen to me. 3 hours ago, I got a call from someone at the regional office in Missoula. They wanted to know if I had any knowledge of an unauthorized assessment activity at Lake Varrun. Someone reported it. Someone who wasn't Foss." Cole went very still. "They asked me specifically about diving activity. About a winter assessment outside of the authorized assessment period. They were very specific about the location. I told them I didn't know anything, and then I spent the last 2 hours trying to figure out who could have called them with that kind of detail. Cole looked at his phone. At the 202 area code in his missed call log. At the frozen lake that had kept something sealed for 70 years until a ranger who walked it every week noticed that the ice was 2 degrees warmer than it should be. The GPS coordinates, he said. When I filed the initial observation report with Foss, he had the GPS coordinates. Danny's voice was careful. Cole, whoever is asking questions, they're not asking them through normal channels. The regional office was contacted directly, not through the district. Someone went around Foss. Cole set the phone on speaker and stared at the 202 number. He thought about a 1968 memo with a department name removed. He thought about 30 crates in a sealed room that an official federal document had described as pending a determination of legal jurisdiction. He thought about the specific kind of power that came from controlling access to objects of extreme value that the rest of the world believed had been destroyed. He thought about his daughter Nora, who called every night at 7:30, and who asked him last week if he was okay because she could hear him thinking. He called her back before he did anything else. She answered on the first ring. Daddy. Hey, sweetheart. You sound different. He watched the orange marker in the failing light. Just a long day at work. Did you figure out the problem? He looked at the ice, at the access hole he'd drilled, at the darkness that sat below 30 feet of frozen water and held something that 7 decades hadn't been enough for someone, somewhere, to let go of. I'm still working on it, he said. But I know what I'm looking at now. Is that good or bad? He thought about the German text. About Adeline's careful notes. About a convoy coming through Eureka at 4 in the morning in November of 1947, before anyone in town was awake to ask questions. I don't know yet, baby. That's the part one still have to figure out. She was quiet for a moment, the way she got when she was deciding something. Then she said, Daddy, will you be careful? He looked at the lake. Yeah, he said. I'll be careful. He called the 202 number back after Nora hung up. It rang 4 times. 5. He was preparing for voicemail when someone picked up. The voice on the other end was measured in male and gave nothing away. Mr. Hardin, we've been trying to reach you. Cole said nothing. There are things about Lake Varrun that require a conversation, the voice said. Things that have been stable for a long time and that need to stay that way. We'd appreciate the chance to speak with you in person before you take any further action. Cole kept his eyes on the orange marker. Who are you? People with an interest in the situation, the voice said. And in making sure it resolves quietly. The line went dead. Cole sat in the truck with the engine running and the heater on and the lake outside the window. 11 miles of ice holding secrets at 30 feet, and understood with a clarity that settled over him like cold water that what he'd found in the dark beneath the ice was something far larger than a mystery. Someone already knew it was there, and they had spent a very long time making sure no one else ever would. Cole sat in the truck for 6 minutes after the call ended. He knew it was 6 minutes because he watched the clock on the dashboard change from 5:14 to 5:20 without moving. And during those 6 minutes, he did something he almost never did, which was think before acting. The voice had known his name, not his last name, not Ranger Hardin in the formal way of official contact. His full name, Mr. Hardin, the way someone used a name when they wanted you to understand they'd already done the work of finding out who you were. They'd also known about the lake, not in vague terms, not as a general inquiry about winter diving in the Kootenai. They'd known the specific location, the specific time period of his activity, and enough about the situation that they'd used the word quietly in a sentence that was meant to sound like an offer, but was structured like a warning. Cole started the truck and drove away from the lake. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He didn't go back toward the station. He drove the 14 miles of Forest Service road and then pulled off onto a logging spur he knew from patrol rounds, a quarter-mile of 2-track that ended in a turnaround where nobody went in January. He killed the headlights and sat in the dark for a moment, then called Danny back. Danny picked up before the second ring. Tell me what happened, Danny said. Cole told him about the 202 number, the measured voice, the word quietly. Danny listened the same way he'd listened the first time Cole called him about the concrete, without interruption and without the filler responses most people used to signal they were paying attention. When Cole finished, Danny was quiet for 5 seconds. Long enough that Cole heard him breathe once. Okay, Danny said. I need you to understand something. A 202 area code is D.C., but D.C. is a big place. It could be a dozen different departments, or it could be a private attorney whose office happens to be in the district. The fact that they called from a D.C. number tells you they want to seem official without actually being official. Cole hadn't considered that. Someone who was genuinely authorized to contact you about this, Danny continued, would have called through the regional office. They would have identified themselves by name and department. They would have a case number or a contact reference. This person did none of those things. They knew your name and your phone number and enough about your activity to be specific about the location, and they asked you to resolve the situation quietly. That's not the language of anyone with a legitimate legal standing. So who are they? Someone who knows about the installation, Danny said. Someone who has known about it for a while, possibly a very long while, and who has a personal or institutional interest in keeping it sealed. And the question is how they found out you'd been there. The GPS coordinates in Cole's initial report to Foss were the most obvious answer, and he said so. Foss would have been required to log the report in the district system. If someone were monitoring activity flags in that system for keywords related to the Varrun area, the report would have surfaced it. That means whoever this is, Danny said slowly, has access to the district reporting system, either directly or through someone who does. Cole thought about that, about what it meant for who he could talk to and who he couldn't. Don't go back to the station tonight, Danny said. Go somewhere else. And don't file anything else through official channels until we figure out what's going on. Cole drove to Eureka instead of the station. He got a room at the motel on the south end of town, the kind of place that had been operating since the 1970s without significant renovation and that didn't ask for anything except cash, which Cole had in the equipment fund envelope he kept in the truck's glove compartment for fuel and supplies. He parked around the back, called Nora at 7:30, ate a package of crackers and some beef jerky from his emergency kit, and lay on a bed that smelled of old carpet and industrial detergent, staring at the ceiling. He thought about Adeline's description of the county assessor watching a military convoy pass through town at 4 a.m. in November of 1947. He thought about the 1968 memo with the redacted department name. He thought about 30 crates above the waterline and an unknown number below, and a second doorway at the far end of the first room opening into darkness. He thought about the voice on the phone. Resolved quietly. He got up at 2 a.m. and drove back to the lake. He knew this was not the rational choice. He knew that the rational choice was to wait, to consult Danny further, to think through his options with the methodical care he applied to everything else in his working life. But he also knew that someone with enough access to flag his GPS coordinates in the district system was not going to wait. If they were monitoring the system, they knew exactly what he'd reported. If they knew what he'd reported, they knew what he'd found. And if they knew what he'd found, the window of time before someone arrived to reseal what he'd opened was not going to be as long as the process of rational deliberation required. The access road to the southern launch point was empty. No vehicles. No tracks in the fresh snow that had fallen since he'd left, which meant no one had come out here since before the snow started falling at around 9 that evening. He set up at the western section in darkness, working by headlamp, and went into the water at 2:47 in the morning. The lake at 3 in the morning was different from the lake at noon. The silence was absolute rather than comparative. Sound moved through the ice above him in long, low frequencies he felt rather than heard. The lake talking to itself in a language that had nothing to do with the humans who occasionally walked across it. Cole descended through the clear black water with his light and his camera and the wrench he'd brought back and the 100-foot safety line he'd extended from the 2 anchors still set at the surface hole. He moved through the open door into the air pocket, surfaced, stripped his face seal. The chamber smelled the same as the first time. He'd been afraid the flooding from the initial opening had destabilized something, but the water line on the walls was unchanged. The current inside had settled. The crates on the upper shelves sat exactly as they'd sat for 70-odd years. He spent 20 minutes photographing the first room properly this time, systematically, shelf by shelf, crate by crate, the stenciling on each one. 15 of the 30 crates above the waterline bore the dual stenciling, English and German, that he'd seen on his first entry. The other 15 were marked only in English and bore designations that looked like inventory codes. rather than descriptions. On 3 of the crates, he could read partial stenciling through the fading that included what appeared to be a weight notation in kilograms. He moved to the second doorway. It stood open, as he'd left it. Beyond it, a corridor ran north for approximately 30 feet, concrete-walled and concrete-floored, the ceiling at roughly 8 feet, high enough that the air pocket extended through the passageway without interruption. His light found a third room at the end of the corridor. Cole moved through. The third room was larger. He needed a moment at the threshold to take in its dimensions. Where the first room was 12 feet wide, this one was closer to 20, and it ran deeper into the earth on the far side than his light could fully reach. The shelving here was different as well, heavier gauge, each shelf reinforced with additional cross-bracing, the uprights thicker than anything that would have been used for light storage. What sat on the shelves was also different. Not crates. Cases. Metal cases, each approximately 3 feet long by 18 inches wide, sealed with a locking mechanism that had been welded shut rather than locked conventionally. The welds were rough and utilitarian, applied without care for appearance, the work of someone for whom permanent closure was the only consideration. Each case bore a single label, not stenciled but stamped in a metal plate riveted to the lid. The stamps were in 3 languages: German, French, English. Cole brought his light close to the nearest one. The English text on the plate read, "Cultural Heritage Property. Protected status under Hague Convention Protocols. Recovery Operation Atlas. 1946. He read it twice. He took a photograph. He read the German text beneath it, or tried to. His German was non-existent beyond the words he'd absorbed from World War II documentaries and whatever cognates existed between English and German. But 3 words in the German section resolved themselves clearly enough that he didn't need translation. The word museum appeared twice. The word beschlagnahmt appeared once, which he was reasonably certain meant something in the vicinity of confiscated or seized. And in the French section, 2 words that required no translation at all: Paris, 1940. Cole Hardin stood in an underwater chamber at the bottom of a frozen Montana lake, his light moving across sealed metal cases stamped with the words Cultural Heritage Property and the year 1946 and the cities of their origin, and felt the specific dread of a man who had found something that too many other people were going to want. He counted the cases visible above the waterline on the first 3 shelves. 41. 4 rows of shelving disappeared below the waterline, and he couldn't count what sat there, but the shelf density was consistent, which meant the room likely held 150 cases or more in total. He photographed everything he could reach. He photographed the stamps. He photographed the welded seals. He moved along each shelf above the waterline and photographed every plate label he could read. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. He ascended at 4:19 in the morning and crossed the dark ice to his truck on legs that were shakier than they should have been. He changed out of the dry suit in the cab with the heater running, sitting on the passenger seat and working his feet free of the 2 short legs. And then he transferred every photograph from his camera to his phone, and then from his phone to the encrypted backup drive he kept in the truck for field assessment records, the same one he'd been using since a hard drive failure had cost him 6 months of lake data 4 years ago. He drove back to the motel. He slept 3 hours. Then he drove to Adeline's shop. She opened the door before he knocked, which meant she'd heard the truck. She looked at his face and stood aside without saying anything. He sat at her back table and pulled up the photographs on his phone. He showed her the crates from the first room. She looked at each one carefully, using the magnifying glass, and said nothing. He showed her the cases from the second room. He showed her the stamped plates. He showed her the words Cultural Heritage Property and Recovery Operation Atlas in 1946. Adeline set the magnifying glass down. He waited. The Recovery Operation Atlas, she said finally, was one of the names used by several informal networks that operated in the immediate post-war period, from approximately 1945 to 1950. The networks included former OSS officers, members of various European intelligence services, private collectors, and certain government officials who understood that the end of the war had created an opportunity that wouldn't last long. Hundreds of thousands of objects had been displaced during the war, looted, moved, hidden, falsely documented. In the confusion of reconstruction, Many of those objects were there to be had by anyone with the right access and the right trucks. What does recovery operation Atlas mean specifically? It means that what's in those cases was taken from somewhere, she said. Not recovered in the sense of being returned to its rightful owners. Recovered in the sense of being acquired. The word is doing a lot of work. From the museums, he said. From Paris, 1940. She nodded. During the occupation, systematic removal of cultural property from French institutions began almost immediately. Not chaotically, systematically. Inventoried. Catalogued. Moved east. After the war, some of those objects were recovered in the proper sense and returned. Some were never found. The official position was that they'd been destroyed or lost in transit or traded through black markets too complicated to trace. And some of them, Cole said, ended up in Montana. She folded her hands. I think what you found may be one of the largest single caches of displaced cultural property in North American history. I want to be careful about saying that because I don't know what's in those cases. But based on the organization of what you're describing, the military involvement, the date stamps, the Atlas designation, I think you're looking at a deliberate, authorized collection operation that was hidden here in 1947 and then sealed and forgotten, or sealed and not forgotten, which is quite different. Sealed and not forgotten, Cole said. The 1968 memo, she said, pending a determination of legal jurisdiction. Someone in 1968 knew those cases were there. They just hadn't decided what to do about them. And someone in the present knew as well. Yes, that's the part that concerns me most. Cole looked at his phone. At the photograph of the stamped plate. Cultural heritage property. Paris, 1940. He thought about what things taken from Paris in 1940 would be worth, catalogued and authenticated, in the present day. He had no frame of reference for that kind of number. He'd spent 8 years assessing the value of ecosystems and water quality and structural ice integrity, none of which had a market price. But he knew that art from major European collections carried values that started in the millions and climbed from there. And he was looking at over 100 sealed cases in the second room alone, plus an unknown quantity submerged below the waterline, plus 30 crates in the first room whose contents he hadn't yet examined. He thought about a 202 area code. He thought about the word quietly. He drove back to the station that afternoon for the first time in 2 days and found that someone had been inside. Nothing was missing. Nothing was obviously disturbed. If he hadn't spent 8 years in the same small space and learned exactly where everything sat, he might not have noticed. But the stack of assessment notebooks on the shelf above his desk was in a different order. The second drawer of the filing cabinet, the one with his field records, was closed all the way when he never closed it all the way because the runner stuck and required a specific angle to open. The propane regulator on the stove had been turned a quarter click past his usual setting. Someone had gone through the station looking for something. They hadn't found what they were looking for because what they were looking for was on the encrypted backup drive currently in the inside pocket of his jacket. He stood in the center of the station cabin and looked at the space where he'd lived for 8 years and felt the cold awareness of his own exposure. He called his district coordinator that afternoon, a woman named Patricia Finn who managed scheduling and logistics for the Lake Division and who had always struck him as fundamentally decent in a bureaucracy that didn't always reward decency. He told her he'd need to be away from the station for several days due to a personal situation and asked her to reroute his patrol routes to neighboring rangers temporarily. Patricia said that would be fine, and then said, "Cole, Foss has been asking about you. About your recent activity reports. He seems frustrated that you submitted a formal assessment request for Varrun without CCNG, the regional coordinator. I followed the standard submission protocol. I know. I'm just telling you what I'm hearing." She paused. "Is everything okay?" He looked around the station. "Yes, everything is fine. I'll be back in a few days." He was not fine. He knew that. But the lie was necessary in the way that certain lies are necessary when the truth requires more trust than the current moment can hold. He went to see Gerald Foss the next morning, not because he wanted to, but because not going would have been more conspicuous than going. He sat across from Foss's desk and told him that the preliminary assessment of the Varrun anomaly had expanded to include evidence of a historical structure with potential cultural heritage significance, and that he believed the situation required involvement beyond the district level. Foss looked at him over the rim of his coffee mug. Cultural heritage. A sealed chamber at depth with contents that appear to predate the lake's current water level by several decades. Foss set down the mug. Cole, I'm going to say this directly. I've received 3 inquiries in the past 4 days about your activity at Varrun. 2 from the regional office and 1 from a federal land management contact I've never spoken with before. All 3 were asking the same thing, which is whether you had conducted unauthorized dive operations at the lake. Cole kept his face neutral. What did you tell them? I told them I had no knowledge of unauthorized operations and that you had submitted a formal assessment request that was under review. Foss looked at him with the expression of a man calculating costs. I also told them that you were one of my most reliable rangers and that any activity you'd conducted in the field would have been within the scope of your professional judgment. Cole hadn't expected that. But I need you to understand something, Foss said. Whatever you found out there, the way this is playing out is not good for either of us. People with more authority than I have are asking questions. If you've opened something that has legal or jurisdictional complications, the correct step is to report it through channels and let those channels handle it. The channels are compromised, Cole said. Foss stared at him. That is a significant thing to say. Someone accessed my initial observation report and used the GPS coordinates to contact me through a personal phone number that isn't in any public record. Someone entered my station while I was away. Foss went still. You're saying someone went into your station? Yes. Did you report it? To who? The same regional office that's been asking questions about my dive activity? A very long silence settled over the room. Foss picked up his coffee mug and set it down again without drinking. Cole, I want to help you, but I need to know what's actually in that lake. Cole thought about the stamped plates. About cultural heritage property in Paris, 1940. About Adeline's words, sealed and not forgotten, which is quite different. He thought about Patricia saying Foss had been asking about him. He said, I'm still completing the assessment. I'll submit a full report when it's ready. Foss looked at him for a moment longer than the look required. Then he nodded and picked up a pen and looked at the papers on his desk, which was how he ended conversations when he decided not to push further. Cole drove back to Eureka and sat in Adeline's back room and tried to think. The regional office inquiries. The station search. The federal land management contact Foss had mentioned, someone Foss had never spoken with before, which in 14 years of district management was notable. Someone was applying pressure through official channels and through unofficial ones simultaneously, and doing it carefully enough that each pressure point looked independent. He called a woman named Margaret Solis that afternoon. He'd met Solis 3 years earlier when she'd come through the Kootenai on a historical land use review contracted by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. She was 62, retired from 20 years as a federal investigator with the Department of the Interior's Inspector General's office, and now worked as a private consultant on cases involving disputed federal land and cultural property. Cole had helped her access survey records during her review, and she'd sent him a handwritten thank you note afterward, which was the kind of thing people did when they remembered who had actually helped them. She picked up on the third ring. Cole Hardin. It's been a long time. He told her everything. He spoke for 11 minutes without interruption, and when he finished, there was a pause on the other end that he'd learned to recognize as the pause of someone who was already deciding what they were going to do rather than deciding whether to help. What you're describing, she said, falls under a specific area of federal and international law that is genuinely complicated. Objects removed from occupied territories during the Second World War and subsequently transported to the United States exist in a legal gray area that hasn't been fully resolved in American courts, partly because most such objects were returned or settled through diplomatic channels in the post-war decades, and partly because the objects that weren't returned were often easier for all involved parties to simply leave ambiguous. The 1968 memo. The 1968 memo is consistent with exactly that pattern, she said. Someone in the federal government knew the installation existed and was storing objects of uncertain legal status, and the decision was made to defer the question rather than answer it, because answering it would have required acknowledging what was in there and who it had been taken from. And now someone wants to keep deferring it, or wants to resolve it in a specific direction before it becomes public. She was quiet for a moment. Cole, I need to ask you something directly. Have you physically removed anything from the installation? No, only photographs. Those photographs are evidence. Depending on how this develops, they may be the most important documentation that exists of those objects' current location and condition. I need you to make multiple copies and store them in locations that aren't connected to your professional life, your station, or your home. He already had 3 copies on the backup drive, his phone, and his camera. He said so. Good. I'm going to make some calls this afternoon and reach out to a contact at the FBI's art crime team, a woman named Dr. Elaine Tran, who has worked cases involving post-war displaced cultural property before. I'm not filing anything officially yet, just a consultation. In the meantime, stay away from anyone connected to the regional office and don't submit anything else through your district system. What do I do about the installation? Don't tell anyone else where it is, she said, and don't let anyone seal it again. After the call, Cole sat in the motel room he'd checked back into and tried to work out what he knew and what he didn't. He knew the installation held at least 2 rooms. He knew the first room contained crates from 1947 stamped with U.S. Army markings and German text. He knew the second room contained sealed metal cases stamped with the words Cultural Heritage Property and Recovery Operation Atlas and bearing city designations from occupied Europe. He knew that someone with access to the federal land management system had flagged his activity within days of his initial report. He knew that someone had searched his station. He didn't know what was in the cases. He didn't know the full extent of the installation. And he didn't know what sat in the corridor beyond the second room, because his safety line had run out before he'd been able to explore further. His phone rang at 7:28. Nora, 2 minutes early. Daddy, she said, I figured something out about the wolves. He felt something loosen in his chest. Tell me. My book says wolves communicate mostly by howling, but the howling is for long distances. For close up, they use these little sounds, kind of like yips and whines, that are much quieter. She paused. So the loud thing isn't really how they talk to each other. The loud thing is for when they're far apart. He thought about that. Yeah, that's exactly right. I was thinking, she said, that's kind of like how you and me talk on the phone. It's the loud version. When I'm with you at the station, we don't talk as much because we don't have to. He sat with that for a moment. This 9-year-old's clear-eyed observation about communication and proximity and what distance costs. That's exactly right, baby. She talked for another 20 minutes about her book and about a science project on bird migration and about a girl at school who had announced that she was going to be a marine biologist when she grew up and how Nora had told her that freshwater ecosystems were just as important as marine ones, but the girl had not been interested in this information. Cole listened and asked questions and kept his voice even and calm, and when she said good night and hung up, he sat in the dark motel room for a long time without moving. He thought about what he was doing, about the 202 number and the search station and the pressure coming through official channels that looked unofficial and the unofficial pressure that was making official inquiries. About Margaret Solis and Dr. Elaine Tran and the specific legal gray area that someone had been maintaining for 70 years because answering the question was harder than deferring it. He thought about the custody agreement that gave him Nora every other weekend, weather permitting. He thought about what losing the job would mean for that arrangement. About a judge looking at an unemployed ranger who'd conducted unauthorized dive operations in a backcountry lake and made claims about hidden wartime cultural property and been reported by multiple federal contacts as a liability risk. He thought about a 9-year-old girl who understood that the howling was for when things were far apart. He was back at the lake the next morning before dawn. He'd driven out via the northern access road this time, coming in from a different direction, adding 23 miles to avoid the southern approach where his tracks from the previous visits were still visible in the snow. He parked the truck off the road entirely, behind a windfall that would conceal it from anyone driving past, and covered the last half-mile to the lake on foot with his gear in a pack. The lake was empty. No tracks except his own from 3 nights ago. The access hole was still open, the edges slightly refrozen from the overnight temperature drop, requiring 15 minutes of work with the auger to clear before he could enter. He went in at 6:47. He moved through the first room without stopping, through the corridor, into the second room. He spent 4 minutes photographing the cases on the shelves he hadn't reached on the previous dive, the ones further back that his safety line hadn't extended to. The stamps were consistent with what he'd already found. Cultural Heritage Property. Recovery Operation Atlas. The city designations changed. Paris appeared frequently, but he also found stamps bearing Amsterdam and Bruges and Krakow. He moved to the far end of the second room. There was a door here as well, identical in construction to the one at the entrance to the first room. This one stood closed, the wheel mechanism intact. He worked it for 3 minutes before it turned, and when it turned, the door swung inward, and cold dark air came through the gap. The third room. He entered and surfaced in the air pocket and turned his light on what was there. He stood in the water for a very long moment without moving. The third room was smaller than the second, approximately 15 feet wide, running back 20 feet. The shelving here held neither crates nor sealed cases. It held a series of flat wooden panels, each one wrapped in cloth and sealed in what appeared to be some kind of waxed material, stacked in frames that held them vertical and separated, the way a serious collector stored paintings. Paintings. They were paintings. He moved to the nearest stack and brought his light close to the edge of one of the panels, where the cloth wrapping had frayed slightly at a corner. Behind the cloth, the edge of a frame was visible, carved gilded wood, old, the gold leaf worn in the way of things that were made before the First World War and handled afterward. He didn't touch it. He photographed it from 3 angles and moved to the next stack. The frames here were different. Smaller, more uniform. These had paper labels attached to the outer wrapping in the same stamp format he'd seen on the cases in the second room. He photographed each label. Some were illegible with age, for were clear enough to read. The first legible label read, Vermeer, J. At. Portrait Study. Amsterdam, acquired 1940. The second, Rembrandt van Rijn. Study with figure, pre-1640. Amsterdam, acquired 1940. The third, Cézanne, P. Landscape with houses, circa 1885. Paris, acquired 1940. The fourth was the one that stopped him completely. He read it 3 times, standing in cold water 30 feet below a frozen lake at 6:51 in the morning, his light steady on the label and his breathing audible in the enclosed space. Raphael, R. School of Madonna with Child. Florence, acquired 1943. Status, missing, presumed destroyed. Uffizi Gallery, Florence, inventory 1944. Missing, presumed destroyed. Cole photographed the label 4 times from different angles. He photographed the wrapped panel it was attached to. He photographed the stacks around it and the frames sticking up from the nearest storage rack and the cloth wrapping on every piece he could reach. He counted 16 stacks of panels, each stack holding between 4 and 8 pieces. If the count was consistent, he was looking at between 64 and 128 individual works in this room alone, some of them attributed to names that didn't require any particular expertise to recognize. Vermeer, Rembrandt, Cézanne, Raphael, works that official records listed as missing, works that had been acquired from occupied European cities in 1940 and 1943 and that had been transported to northern Montana and sealed in a concrete chamber at the bottom of a lake and left there for 77 years while the world officially believed they were gone. He checked his air. He needed to ascend. He had 2 minutes of safe bottom time remaining, and he was 30 feet down, and the air pocket above him was the only reason he was alive. He took one more photograph. The whole room from the doorway, his light at full intensity, catching the stacked frames and the storage racks and the wrapped panels reaching back into the dark. Then he ascended. He broke the surface, gasping not from lack of air, but from the weight of what he'd seen, which was its own kind of pressure. He pulled himself out onto the ice and lay on his back for a moment with the January sky above him and the lake below him and 77 years of officially missing European painting somewhere in between. A Vermeer, a Rembrandt, a Cézanne, works that any major museum in the world would have listed among its most irreplaceable losses. Works that the families they'd been taken from in 1940 had spent decades hoping to recover and been told, officially, were gone. They were not gone. They were at 6,800 feet in northern Montana in a lake that most people had never heard of, sealed behind a door that a ranger had opened with a borrowed wrench and a safety line, and the particular stubbornness of someone who found a warmer patch of ice and decided it needed explaining. Cole sat up and looked at the orange marker still standing at the edge of the access hole. He needed Margaret Solis. He needed Dr. Elaine Tran at the FBI's art crime team. He needed someone with the authority to secure this installation before whoever had searched his station and called from a 202 number decided that the most efficient solution was not a conversation, but a resealing. He picked up his phone and found a text message from a number he didn't recognize, sent 22 minutes ago while he was in the water. The message read, "We know you went back. The window for a quiet resolution is closing. Last chance. Cole looked at the message for a long time. Then he looked at the lake. At 11 miles of frozen water and the ridgelines beyond it, and the sky above them, gray and cold and indifferent. He typed back a single word. No. Then he called Margaret Solis. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting for his call. Dr. Tran is ready to speak with you, she said without preamble. She needs everything. The photographs, the GPS coordinates, the text messages. Everything you have. Cole looked at the lake one more time. At the orange marker that had been there since December, waiting for him to follow it down to something that should have been found 30 years ago and might have been meant to never be found at all. He thought about the Raphael label. Madonna with child. Missing, presumed destroyed. Not destroyed. Waiting. He got in the truck and started the engine and began the drive that would change everything. Margaret Solis lived in a house outside Whitefish that had been built in 1934 by a timber contractor who'd wanted something that would outlast him. It had. The logs were old-growth larch, the kind of wood that got harder with age rather than softer. And the house sat back from the road behind a stand of ponderosa that blocked sight lines from both directions. Cole found it by the GPS coordinates she'd texted him, not an address, just numbers, which told him something about how she'd been operating since she left the Interior Department. She was standing on the porch when he pulled up, and behind her, visible through the front window, a woman sat at the kitchen table with a laptop open and what appeared to be a substantial amount of paperwork spread around it. Dr. Elaine Tran was 44 years old, small and precise in her movements, with the particular quality of attention that Cole associated with people who'd spent careers looking at things other people had misidentified. She'd spent 19 years with the FBI's art crime team before moving to a senior investigative role with the Carabinieri's Cultural Heritage Protection Unit in Rome. She was in Montana because Margaret had called in a debt that apparently predated both of their current careers, and because what Cole had photographed in that underwater chamber was the kind of thing that Dr. Tran had spent 19 years looking for without finding. She shook Cole's hand when he came in, looked at him for a moment the way she probably looked at everything, taking inventory, and said, "Show me the photographs. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you." He connected the backup drive to her laptop and transferred everything. 314 photographs taken across 5 dives in January water at 30 feet. She went through them without speaking, enlarging each one, moving through the sequence methodically. Margaret made coffee. Cole sat at the table and watched Tran's face for the reactions that would tell him whether what he'd found was what he thought it was. She spent 4 minutes on the photographs from the first room, 7 minutes on the second room's case labels. When she reached the third room, the photographs of the wrapped panels and the storage frames, she stopped moving. She enlarged the image of the Raphael label until the text filled the screen. She read it. She sat back in her chair. She looked at Cole. Madonna with child. She said it in the way of someone speaking the name of a person rather than a painting. It was reported destroyed in a Luftwaffe bombing raid on a Florentine storage facility in March of 1944. The Uffizi has carried it on their missing works list for 80 years. Cole waited. There are 17 works, she said, in the photographs of the third room alone that match the descriptions of pieces on the Interpol Works of Art database. 2 more that match descriptions in the Art Loss Register. And the Vermeer attribution, if it holds, she paused and looked at the photograph again, would be the 4th authenticated Vermeer to surface since 1990. The last one sold at auction for $38 million, and that was in 2018. Margaret set coffee in front of Cole and Tran and sat down across from them. "What we're looking at," she said, "is a recovery and authentication operation that's going to take months, possibly years. The legal questions around ownership, repatriation, cultural property law, international treaty obligations, they're not going to resolve in a week. But the first step is securing the installation. Who has authority to do that?" Cole asked. "That depends on what the installation is classified as," Tran said. "If it's federal property, then the General Services Administration has jurisdiction. If the contents are covered under the National Stolen Property Act, that's FBI. If international treaty obligations apply, which they do for anything removed from occupied territories before 1945, that triggers State Department involvement. And if criminal activity is connected to the current attempt to suppress the discovery, which that text message suggests, we're looking at a potential obstruction charge that opens another door entirely. Cole thought about the phone call from the 202 number. The search station. The text arriving while he was underwater. The practical answer, Tran said, is that I can have a federal preservation order on the installation within 72 hours, which prevents anyone from accessing, disturbing, or removing anything from the site while the jurisdictional question is resolved. That order doesn't require a determination of who owns what. It just requires evidence that significant cultural property of uncertain provenance is present and at risk. And the photographs are that evidence. The photographs are that evidence. Cole looked at the 314 images on the screen, at the Raphael label, at the Vermeer and Rembrandt frames sticking up from the storage rack like old secrets tired of being kept. Do it, he said. The preservation order came through in 58 hours, not 72, because Dr. Tran called people at the FBI's Washington field office, who called people at the Department of Justice, who called people at the State Department, and the conversation at each level was apparently brief and unambiguous. On the morning the order was filed, Cole received a call from Gerald Foss. The call lasted 4 minutes. Foss spoke in the measured tone of a man reading from a script that someone else had helped him prepare. The regional office has received notification of a federal preservation order on Lake Varrun, he said. This is going to require a formal review of your recent assessment activity. A meeting has been scheduled for next Thursday in Missoula with the regional director and the district legal counsel. Cole said he'd be there. There's also been a complaint, Foss said, filed by a federal land management contact with the regional director's office, alleging unauthorized assessment operations, falsification of field reports, and conduct detrimental to the district's relationship with federal partner agencies. Cole waited. Foss's voice shifted slightly when he continued. I want you to know that I have submitted a written response stating that your field reports are consistent with 8 years of accurate and reliable documentation, and that the assessment activity at Varrun was within the professional discretion afforded to senior rangers under the district field assessment guidelines. Cole hadn't expected that either. Foss, he said. I'm not an idiot, Cole. Foss's voice was flat, but not unkind. I've been managing this district for 14 years. I know what it looks like when someone with resources tries to manage a problem by going through official channels. And I know what it looks like when the person being managed is right. He paused. Thursday, 10 o'clock. Don't be late. The complaint was the first visible move from whoever was operating behind the 202 number, and it arrived simultaneously with 2 others. Cole's ex-wife's attorney filed a motion with the family court citing media reports about Cole's federal complaint as evidence of professional instability, though there were no media reports yet because nothing had been made public. The motion appeared to be based on knowledge of the federal complaint that couldn't have come from any public source, which meant someone had told Diane's attorney about it before it was officially filed. Cole called his own attorney from Adeline's back room and explained the situation. The attorney was quiet for a moment. Someone gave Diane's attorney information from a sealed federal complaint, she said. That's what it looks like. That's potentially a federal crime, Cole. Whoever did that just handed us something. He thought about the 1968 memo with the redacted department name. About 70 years of deferral. About an organization that had maintained the secret this long by applying pressure through multiple channels simultaneously, always making each pressure point look independent so no one could see the full shape of it. He thought about the night in the motel room weighing the custody arrangement against everything else, the specific cold calculation of what he stood to lose if this went wrong. The attorney said she'd file a counter motion citing the irregular disclosure and request an emergency stay on any custody hearing until the source of the disclosure was identified. Cole agreed, thanked her, and sat for a moment after the call ended. Adeline came in from the front of the shop with 2 cups of tea she hadn't asked him if he wanted. They're frightened, she said, sitting across from him. Whoever has been managing this for 70 years. They've been operating in the assumption that the longer it stayed sealed, the more certain the future legal outcome. Every year that passed without discovery was another year of precedent. Another year of official records listing those works as destroyed. She wrapped both hands around her cup. When the statute of limitations on certain kinds of cultural property claims expires, ownership reverts to whoever holds the physical object. Some of those clocks have been running since 1945. Cole looked at her. How close are they? Some of them may already have expired, she said carefully. Some may not. It would depend on the specific piece, the specific jurisdiction, the specific treaty. That's the kind of analysis that takes lawyers months to complete. But the urgency of their response to your discovery suggests that at least some of what's in those cases is approaching the end of a legal window, or that they believed it was close enough that discovery now was worse than discovery in 5 years. Cole thought about that, about someone spending 7 decades managing a legal countdown rather than a moral one. He drove back to Whitefish. Dr. Tran had assembled a team that now occupied most of Margaret's living room. A legal specialist from the FBI's Cultural Property Unit, a forensic art historian from the Smithsonian's Provenance Research Office, a woman named Dr. Celia Barros who'd flown in from Washington and who spoke about paintings the way Cole spoke about ice, with the particular authority of someone who'd been paying attention for a long time, and a young FBI agent named Ruiz who was tracking the 202 number and the text messages and the station breach through whatever investigative resources he had access to, all of which he discussed in brief statements that gave Cole the impression of someone doing significantly more than he was describing. Ruiz had found the 202 number. It was registered to a legal services firm in Washington that represented, among other clients, a private holding company called Veritas Cultural Trust, incorporated in Delaware in 1989 as a nonprofit cultural preservation organization. The trust's board of directors included 4 names that Tran recognized immediately: 2 former museum directors, a retired diplomat, and a 4th name that made her stop speaking briefly before continuing. The 4th name was listed on the trust's original incorporation documents as a founding board member, she said. He died in 1991, but his estate, administered by his son, remained the primary financial contributor to the trust through the present day. She looked at Cole. His father was one of the officers named in the 1947 convoy records I found in the Army Corps of Engineers archive this morning. Someone had passed the installation down, Cole said. Like an inheritance, Margaret said. A private one, not the legal kind that gets recorded in probate court. The kind where a father tells a son, and the son tells his children, that there is something that needs to be watched over, that certain questions should never be asked and certain places should never be disturbed. She paused, and then a ranger with a drill and too much patience disturbs it anyway. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The authentication operation began the following week. The federal preservation order had secured the installation and the dive team that Tran brought in, 3 divers with dry suit experience and a remotely operated underwater vehicle that could reach the submerged lower shelves, spent 6 days documenting the full contents of all 3 rooms. The numbers that emerged from the documentation were staggering in ways that Cole had not fully anticipated even after seeing the Raphael label. The first room held 38 crates above the waterline and 41 below. The contents of the dry upper crates were intact. The submerged lower crates had taken on water over the decades, but the concrete of the chamber had acted as insulation against the full range of temperature variation, and the water inside was cold enough that biological degradation had been minimal. The crates held gold currency, coins and small bars, primarily German and French, dated between 1930 and 1944, with a total weight that the recovery team's preliminary assessment put at approximately 4,000 kilograms. At current market rates, Dr. Barros told Cole when the preliminary count came in, the gold content alone is worth somewhere between $200 and $240 million at spot price. But the numismatic value of some of these coins, the historical and collector value beyond the raw metal, is considerably more. Cole sat with that for a moment. The second room's cases held documents, currency, bonds, and a category of object that Dr. Barros described as portable valuables. Jewelry, primarily. Watches. Items of small dimension and large individual value that had been systematically collected and cataloged in 1946 and placed in sealed cases. The provenance stamps on the cases connected the contents to institutions and private collections across occupied Europe. Jewish families in Amsterdam and Paris and Krakow whose names Dr. Barros sometimes paused on, in the way of someone encountering a word that required extra care. The third room held 112 paintings. 14 were definitively attributed to recognized masters with a level of certainty that could be established from visual examination alone. Full authentication would require laboratory analysis, infrared reflectography, chemical sampling. But Dr. Barros, standing in the chamber on the fourth day of documentation while Cole watched through the ROV feed from the surface, spoke each attribution aloud in the level voice of someone delivering accurate information rather than performing astonishment. Vermeer, Rembrandt, Cezanne, two Monets, a Goya that she called remarkable twice in the same sentence. A Botticelli that had been listed as destroyed in a fire at a German holding facility in 1945. And the Raphael, which she examined for 4 full minutes without speaking before saying, quietly, to no one in particular, "I've been looking for this one for 20 years. The total preliminary value, assembled from Dr. Barros's assessments, the gold inventory, the bond and currency evaluation, and the jewelry catalog, was released internally to the FBI team 3 weeks after the documentation operation concluded. The number was $480 million. That was the preliminary number, before full authentication, before the numismatic premiums, before the auction values that applied to pieces whose status had shifted from destroyed to recovered. $480 million. Hidden beneath a frozen lake in Lincoln County, Montana, at 6,800 feet, sealed in 1952 by a classified federal order from a department whose name someone had thought it important to remove from the record. Cole received the number by phone from Margaret, standing at the window of his station cabin, looking out at the eastern ridge. He wrote it down in his notebook in the same format he used for ice depth measurements and temperature readings. Then he stood at the window for a while. The Veritas Cultural Trust filed a legal claim to the contents of the installation 4 days later, asserting that the trust had maintained continuous custodial responsibility for the materials since 1952 and that the federal preservation order violated their legal standing as the documented guardians of the collection. The claim was filed in the D.C. District Court on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, it had generated responses from 3 separate governments. The Netherlands, France, and Poland each filed formal diplomatic notifications asserting that objects removed from their territories under occupation fell under the 1954 Hague Convention's repatriation provisions, which superseded any private custodial claim established after the initial unlawful removal. The Italian government filed a separate notification specifically referencing the Raphael. The German federal government filed a statement supporting the repatriation positions and requesting access to the documentation from Recovery Operation Atlas for the purposes of their own historical accounting. The trust's claim collapsed within 11 days of its filing. Veritas Cultural Trust announced the resignation of its entire board of directors on a Wednesday afternoon in a statement that said nothing and explained everything. The Thursday meeting in Missoula had been rescheduled twice and finally took place 5 weeks after Foss first called Cole about it. In a conference room at the regional director's office that was larger than Cole had expected and contained, on the day of the meeting, several people who had not been mentioned when the meeting was scheduled. The regional director was there. The district legal counsel was there. 2 representatives from the FBI's field office in Helena were there. And a woman from the Department of the Interior's Cultural Property Office who had flown in from Washington and who introduced herself to Cole with the firm handshake of someone who'd spent the morning being briefed on a situation that had grown well beyond its original parameters. The complaint against Cole was formally withdrawn at the beginning of the meeting. The regional director said this in a tone suggesting the withdrawal had been his idea rather than a requirement imposed by the presence of 2 FBI representatives and ADC official, and Cole did not correct the suggestion because the outcome was the same regardless of whose idea it had been. The formal review of his assessment activity concluded that his actions had been within the scope of professional discretion available to senior rangers under field assessment guidelines. The Interior Department representative used the phrase exemplary field judgment, which Cole suspected she'd written before she arrived. Foss shook Cole's hand after the meeting, in the hallway, away from the conference room. He said, "You're going to be impossible to manage now, Cole." Cole said, "I was always impossible to manage." Foss looked at him with something that took a moment to identify as respect, because it wasn't an expression Cole had seen on his supervisor's face before. Then he said, "The Varrun assessment circuit is yours for as long as you want it," and walked back toward the elevator. The custody motion was withdrawn by Diane's attorney 2 weeks later, coinciding precisely with the FBI's confirmation that the disclosure of Cole's sealed complaint to a family court attorney had originated from a contact associated with a former board member of Veritas Cultural Trust. Cole's attorney filed a motion noting the withdrawal and requesting that the court record reflect the irregular circumstances of the original filing. The court agreed. The original custody arrangement remained in place. Cole told Nora on a phone call that lasted 45 minutes, explaining what had happened in terms a 9-year-old could follow. He told her about the warm ice and the auger and the camera on the cord and the air pocket inside the chamber and the paintings in the third room with their labels and their city names. She listened without interrupting, which she'd gotten from him. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Daddy, the people who took those paintings from the families, did they know what they were doing was wrong?" He thought about that. Yes. And they did it anyway. Yes. And then somebody else kept the secret for a really long time. Somebody else kept the secret for a very long time. She processed this with the gravity she applied to things that mattered. And you found it because you noticed the ice was a little bit different. He looked out the window at the lake, invisible from the station but present the way large things always were. "Yeah, baby. Because I noticed the ice was a little bit different." She said, "I'm proud of you, Daddy," in the same voice she used for important announcements, and the straightforward weight of it settled over him like a hand on the shoulder. The repatriation process began in the spring of the following year. It was slow because the law was slow, and because the questions of ownership that the 1968 memo had described as pending a determination of legal jurisdiction turned out to be exactly as complicated as the person who wrote that sentence had understood them to be. Some questions were answered quickly. The gold currency was divided among successor governments whose nationals had held the original assets, a determination made through documentation that Recovery Operation Atlas had helpfully cataloged before sealing the crates. The bonds and financial instruments were handled through an international banking consortium that had dealt with post-war financial restitution cases before and knew the procedures. The paintings were harder. 414 of the 112 pieces, clear provenance chains connected the works to specific families or institutions whose successors were identified and verified. The return of those pieces was not a court proceeding. It was a ceremony, conducted on different days in different cities over the course of 8 months, and Cole was invited to each one and attended 3. The first was in Amsterdam, where a painting attributed to the school of Rembrandt was returned to the grandchildren of the family from whose collection it had been removed in 1940. The grandchildren were in their 50s and 60s. The oldest, a man named David who had his grandmother's eyes in a photograph Cole had seen in the documentation file, held the painting for a long time before handing it to the museum director who would provide temporary stewardship while permanent arrangements were finalized. He held it the way you hold something you'd been told your whole life was gone. Cole stood at the back of the room during the ceremony and watched. He'd been introduced at the beginning and then mostly forgotten, which was as it should be. This wasn't his moment. His moment had been at 6:47 in the morning on a frozen lake in January, alone, working a wheel mechanism that hadn't moved in 70 years. The second ceremony was in Paris. A Monet, small, a study rather than a finished work, returned to a cultural foundation established by the descendants of the collector from whose estate it had been taken. The foundation's director, a woman in her 40s who'd spent her career in cultural restitution law, said in her remarks that discovery was the easy part and justice was the long part, and she was grateful that in this case, both had arrived in the same generation. Cole flew home from Paris on a Thursday and drove from Great Falls Airport directly to the lake. He arrived in the evening, parked at the southern access point in the last of the light, and walked out onto the ice. It was April. The ice was still solid in the center of the lake, but had begun to soften at the edges, the seasonal thaw working inward from the shores, the lake beginning the long process of becoming itself again after winter. He walked carefully, testing each step the way he always did, his boots leaving prints that would be gone by July. He walked to the western section. The access hole had been sealed by the Federal Preservation Team after documentation concluded, a steel cover bolted into the ice surface, and then the ice itself allowed to refreeze around it. The orange marker was still there. He'd left it. He stood at the marker and looked down at the ice. Beneath him, 30 feet down in cold, clear water, 3 rooms full of sealed cases and stacked frames, and the particular darkness of places that have been kept closed for a very long time. The preservation order was still in place. The ROV team was returning in May to begin the recovery of the submerged materials from the lower shelves, a process that would take most of the summer. The installation would likely remain under federal management for 2 years, possibly more. He thought about what Adeline had told him the morning after he showed her the Raphael label, when he'd come back to her shop and found her already up and already looking through her files. She'd found a reference she hadn't thought of in 20 years, a letter in the State Archive from 1948, written by an Army Corps officer to a friend in civilian life. The letter was mundane for most of its length, family news and weather complaints and the difficulty of getting decent coffee in Lincoln County in October. And then one paragraph, near the end, which had caused the original archivist to flag the letter in a miscellaneous file rather than the subject-indexed collection. The paragraph read, "I'll tell you something I probably shouldn't, but it'll be on the bottom of a lake in 10 years when the water level comes up, and nobody will ever find it anyway. We moved some things this fall that should have gone home to people who needed them. They didn't go home. I don't know why exactly, or rather I do know and I don't like it. But that's above my pay grade and always was. I just drove one of the trucks. Above my pay grade and always was." Cole stood on the ice and thought about that officer, whose name was not in the letter, who had driven a truck and known it was wrong and been correct that nobody would find it, except that nobody had turned into 77 years, and a ranger who walked 11 lakes and noticed that one section of ice was 2 degrees warmer than the surrounding surface. He heard the wolves that evening. He'd been walking back toward the southern shore when they started, from the eastern ridge, 2 of them at first, and then a third, the sound coming down off the ridge and across the frozen lake with the particular carrying quality of cold air in spring when the atmosphere was stable and sound moved true. He stopped walking and listened. Nora was going to hear this in February. He'd promised. Road conditions had kept her away through most of January and February, but the summer access was good, and he'd already spoken to Diane about Nora spending part of July at the station. Diane had agreed without the usual deliberation, which Cole attributed partly to the custody motion withdrawal and partly to something he'd noticed in their last 2 conversations, a slight shift in her register when she talked about the lake. Less distance in it than before. The wolves went quiet after a few minutes. He stood in the last of the April evening and listened to the silence they left behind, which was different from the silence before they'd started. He thought about the way Nora had explained it. The loud thing is for when they're far apart. The 3rd repatriation ceremony he attended was in Florence. Dr. Barrows had arranged for him to be there, had insisted on it in the particular way she insisted on things that she'd decided mattered, with a directness that left no room for polite refusal. The Raphael had been fully authenticated over the course of 4 months by a team that included specialists from the Uffizi, the Getty Conservation Institute, and the Op Officio del Pietre Dure in Florence. The authentication process had itself generated a paper that Dr. Barrows had published in the Burlington magazine, the first authenticated Raphael reattribution in 11 years. The ceremony was held in a room at the Uffizi that Cole had never been inside, a small gallery not open to the public, white walls, and even lighting, and the kind of careful institutional silence that museums maintained like a second atmosphere. Dr. Barrows stood beside him and translated when the Italian exceeded his comprehension, which was most of the time. The painting was smaller than he'd expected. He'd imagined something monumental from the weight the Raphael label had carried in his mind, but the Madonna with Child was intimate in scale, meant to be seen from close distance rather than across a gallery. The figures had the quality of being looked at rather than displayed, the kind of presence that made you understand what the painting had been for before it became valuable enough to be stolen. The Uffizi's director spoke first, in Italian. Dr. Barrows leaned close to Cole and translated in a low voice. "She's saying that some losses mark a generation, and the return of what was lost marks the generation that achieves it. She's saying that the people in this room are the generation that achieved this." Then the director said something else, shorter, and looked directly at Cole. "She's saying that it began with a ranger who noticed the ice was warmer than it should be and did not decide that was someone else's problem." Cole looked at the painting, at the Raphael that had been listed in the Uffizi inventory for 80 years as missing, presumed destroyed, present, accounted for, home. He thought about the photographs on his station wall, not paintings, just photographs he'd pinned up over 8 years. Assessment images, mostly. Ice formations. Algae surveys. One photograph of the lake in October when the light came off the water at the angle that made it look like something from a different kind of world. He'd taken that photograph in his second year at the station, before Diane, before Nora, before any of this, just because the light had done something remarkable and he'd been there to see it, and it had seemed important to record that it had happened. In July, Nora came to the station for 3 weeks. She was taller than she'd been in February. She wore the same rain jacket she'd had since she was 7, the green one with the broken zipper on the left chest pocket that she refused to replace because, as she'd explained once with perfect logic, the zipper didn't affect how warm it was. She arrived on a Friday afternoon and walked straight into the station without being told to, because she'd been coming here long enough that walking straight in was correct, and set her bag on the bed in the room that had been her room since she was 6. Cole made pasta for dinner, the same pasta he always made because it was the thing he was reliably good at, and they ate at the small table by the window that looked east toward the ridge. She asked him questions about the lake that she'd been saving up since April. He could tell by the order of them, the way they built on each other in the sequence of someone who'd been thinking through a subject for months. She wanted to know what the air had smelled like inside the chamber. She wanted to know how cold 34-degree water felt on your face. She wanted to know what the Raphael looked like in person. Smaller than you'd think, he said, but the faces looked real. Like the person who painted them had known those faces. She thought about that, like he was trying to remember them. Cole looked at her. Yeah, exactly like that. She was quiet for a moment, pushing pasta around her plate in the thinking pattern he'd learned to recognize. Then she said, "Daddy, do you think if you hadn't noticed the ice, someone else would have eventually?" He thought about Harold Fent, the county assessor who'd watched the convoy pass through town in 1947 and written in his diary that he hadn't believed the Geological Survey explanation. About the Army officer who'd driven one of the trucks and known it was wrong and been certain that the lake would rise and keep the secret forever. About 77 years of water, holding something that should have been found and given back decades earlier. Maybe, he said, eventually. But it was you. It was me. She considered this with the deliberateness she brought to things that mattered. Because you walked the same lake for 8 years and noticed when something changed. He looked at her across the table. The green jacket with the broken zipper. The expression that was already more serious than most adults he knew. Yeah, baby. Because I walked the same lake and noticed when something changed. She nodded once, in the way she did when she'd resolved something she'd been working on. I want to learn to dive, she said. Not now. When I'm older. I want to learn properly. There are probably other things down there. In other lakes. Cole looked at his daughter. At this 9-year-old who had been calling him at 7:30 every night for months while he'd been standing at the edge of something whose dimensions he couldn't see, and who had waited patiently for the part where he came home and made pasta and sat across from her at a small table by a window that looked east toward a ridge where wolves lived. There are definitely other things down there, he said. She picked up her fork again. Then we should find them. He looked out the window at the eastern ridge and then at the lake beyond it, 11 miles of water that would stay frozen for another 3 months and then open up into summer, the cycle it had followed for longer than anyone who'd ever named it had been alive. What remained of the Veritas Cultural Trust leadership was under federal investigation for obstruction of a cultural property recovery and unauthorized disclosure of sealed legal proceedings. The D.C. attorney whose firm had placed the 202 call had lost his license to practice in federal courts. The son of the original board member whose father had driven one of those trucks in 1947, the man whose name Margaret had paused on, had retained 4 lawyers and was cooperating with investigators in the way of people who had decided that cooperation was now in their interest. The gold from the first room had been valued at $223 million after numismatic assessment. The full authentication of all 112 paintings was expected to conclude the following spring, but the preliminary estimate, assembled by Dr. Barros and 2 colleagues and reviewed by 3 auction houses, put the total collection value at somewhere between $800 million and $1.2 billion. Those numbers appeared in newspapers in 31 countries. They were repeated on television and radio and across every platform that repeated numbers like that, because numbers like that were the kind that moved through the world quickly. What moved more slowly were the other stories. The David with his grandmother's eyes holding the Rembrandt School painting in Amsterdam. The foundation director in Paris who'd spent her career in restitution law and had not expected to see a case like this in her working life. The letter from a family in Krakow whose great-grandparents' names appeared on a provenance document in the second room's case files, who wrote to Dr. Tran to say they had a photograph of the object in question sitting on a mantelpiece in their great-grandparents' apartment in 1937, and they had never known what happened to it, and now they did. Cole kept that letter, a printed copy, in his station notebook alongside the ice depth measurements and the assessment records. He'd received it forwarded from Dr. Tran because the family had asked her to pass it along, and he'd read it twice and then put it in the notebook because it belonged there. With the work. On a cold morning in the following January, exactly 1 year after he'd stood on the ice and pressed his palm flat against a surface 2 degrees warmer than the ice beside it, Cole walked out onto Lake Varrun. The temperature was -16. His breath came in even white bursts that the wind took and scattered. The pressure crack he'd been monitoring in the southeastern section had widened by 2 inches since his last visit. He recorded the measurement in his notebook. He photographed the crack from 3 angles. He noted the GPS coordinates and the date and the air temperature and the approximate snow depth above the fault line. And then he moved north along the western shore, where the steel cover plate over the access hole sat flush with the ice. The recovery operation completed, the installation empty now, its contents distributed to the museums and families and government repositories where they belonged. He stopped at the orange marker, which he'd never removed. He stood there for a moment. Around him, 11 miles of frozen water stretched to its ridgelines. The spruce on the eastern shore had gone dark with the afternoon light. Temperature was dropping another 4 degrees before nightfall. He pulled out his notebook and wrote the date and the conditions and the access hole status, closed and sealed, and then on the same line, 2 words that he'd never written in a field assessment before and that had no official place in the documentation system, but that seemed accurate. All clear. He capped the pen and put the notebook away and walked back toward the shore, his boots on the ice making the sound that always moved across the lake and came back changed, the sound of someone paying attention when no one was watching, which was how the best things always started. The summer recovery operation began on the 14th of May, when the ice on Lake Varrun had retreated far enough from the western shore to allow a work barge to anchor in open water directly above the installation. The barge was a flat-bottomed platform owned by a geological survey company out of Kalispell that had been contracted by the FBI's art crime team, and it sat on the lake with the slightly improbable quality of heavy equipment in a place that heavy equipment had no business being. Cole watched it get positioned from the southern shore, standing in knee-high rubber boots on the muddy bank where the ice had pulled back, his hands in his jacket pockets. The dive team was 6 people, none of them rangers, all of them with credentials in commercial diving and underwater recovery that made Cole's single-diver winter operation look exactly as improvised as it had been. They were professional without being unfriendly, and the team lead, a woman named Sasha who had done underwater archaeological work on 3 continents, shook Cole's hand the first morning and said she'd read his field notes from the winter dives and that they were some of the most useful pre-operation documentation she'd worked from. He thanked her and tried not to show that this meant more to him than the Interior Department representative's phrase exemplary field judgment had. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The work progressed in stages determined by what the water allowed. The ROV handled the initial survey of the lower shelves, the submerged tiers that Cole had been unable to fully document in January. The footage came up to the barge's monitoring station in real time, and Cole sat beside Sasha on the second day of operation, watching the ROV's lights move across the lower shelves of the first room, where the crates had been sitting in water for decades. The lower crates had taken on water. That much was visible from the exterior, the wood swollen and darkened, and in some cases structurally compromised enough that the recovery team had to design containment systems before moving anything. But the contents of the gold crates were indifferent to water in the way that gold was indifferent to most things. And when the first sealed wooden box was brought to the surface and opened by a conservator wearing gloves, the coins inside were exactly what they had been in 1947. Heavy, cold, stamped with dates and faces and the particular precision of mints that had understood they were making permanence. The second room's lower cases presented a different challenge. Water had entered some of them through failed seals, and the documents and currency inside had not survived as cleanly as the gold. Dr. Barros oversaw this stage from the barge with the focused attention of someone doing triage, making rapid assessments about which cases needed immediate conservation treatment and which could withstand the journey to the restoration facility in Missoula without additional intervention. She worked 14 hours a day for the first 2 weeks of the operation and did not complain about this. And Cole brought her coffee every morning because it was the only useful thing he could do while she worked, and because bringing people coffee when they were doing something important was a value his mother had instilled in him so completely it was no longer a choice. The third room's lower storage yielded 26 additional panels beyond what the ROV had initially cataloged, each one sealed in the waxed cloth that had been used for the upper shelves as well. The cloth had kept the water out with varying effectiveness. 11 of the 26 were in excellent condition, the wax having done its job over 7 decades with a thoroughness that the person who applied it could not have anticipated needing. 7 were in fair condition, recoverable with proper treatment. 8 were compromised to degrees that ranged from partial loss to near total deterioration. The 8 were the ones Dr. Barros spent the most time with. She would stand at the conservation table on the barge and work with the textile conservator and the painting specialist who'd flown in from the Getty, and they would examine each compromised panel with the equipment they'd brought and the patience of people who had learned that patience was the most technical skill in their field. Cole watched sometimes, from a respectful distance. He didn't know what most of the instruments did, but he understood what the faces of the people using them expressed, which was the particular grief of someone trying to recover a thing that had already decided how much it was willing to give back. One of the 8 was beyond recovery. The conservators were certain by the third examination. Dr. Barros recorded the attribution, the provenance documentation from the case label, the condition assessment, and the determination, and then she stood at the railing of the barge and looked at the lake for a while without speaking. Cole came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything either. Some situations were complete without commentary. She said finally, it was a small Corot. Landscape with a stream. The label said it came from a private collection in Bruges. Acquired 1940. She paused. Someone loved that painting before 1940. Someone hung it somewhere in their house and looked at it every day and considered it part of the furniture of their life. She looked at the water. And now it's pigment and canvas and nothing else. And the person who destroyed it, which is what this was, destroying it by stealing it and sealing it in water, they've been dead for decades and never answered for it. Cole thought about the army officer's letter. Above my pay grade and always was. The accounting for that, he said, is probably not the kind that happens in a courtroom. She looked at him. That's an unusual thing for a federal ranger to say. He thought about ice and patience and 11 miles of water, holding something for 77 years. It's an unusual situation. The Krakow family's object was a silver kiddush cup, documented in the second room's inventory as cultural and religious property, Polish-Jewish provenance, acquired 1942. It was 8 inches tall, elaborately engraved around the base and rim, and it had belonged to a family named Goldstein, whose story Dr. Tran's team had reconstructed from the provenance documentation and the records of the Arolsen archives in Germany, the central repository for documentation of Nazi persecution. The Goldstein family had lived in Krakow. The father, Abraham, was a watchmaker. The mother, Rivka, taught music. There were 3 children. The cup had been a wedding gift to Abraham and Rivka in 1927, engraved with their names and the date of their marriage, and a phrase from the Song of Songs in Hebrew. It appeared in a photograph taken at a family gathering in 1938, sitting on a table beside a challah bread and candles, and the faces of people who didn't yet know what was coming. None of the family had survived the war. The letter from the Krakow family that Cole had received forwarded from Dr. Tran came from a great-nephew, the son of a cousin who had emigrated to Argentina before the war and whose own children and grandchildren now lived between Buenos Aires and Krakow. His name was Daniel. He was 57 years old. He'd found out about the Lake Varrun discovery through a cultural restitution organization that had sent him a notification when the Goldstein name appeared in the provenance documentation. I did not know this cup existed, Daniel had written. My family knew that Abraham and Rivka had owned beautiful things because they owned beautiful things, but we had no inventory and no photographs of most of them. When the organization sent me the photograph from the provenance documentation, I showed it to my mother, who is 89 years old and lives with me in Buenos Aires. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "I remember my father describing this cup. He told me his cousin Abraham received it as a wedding gift. He said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen." Cole had read that paragraph 7 times over the course of the weeks after receiving it. He read it the way he read ice depth measurements, looking for what the numbers actually said beneath what they appeared to say. The cup was returned to Daniel at a ceremony in Krakow in October. Cole attended, flying overnight from Denver with the particular exhaustion of air travel that arrived before the destination felt real. The ceremony was in the old Jewish quarter, in a building that had been a cultural center since the 1990s and that held, in its main room, the specific kind of quiet that spaces accumulated from long association with grief and memory. Daniel was shorter than Cole had expected from the weight his letter had carried. He was a quiet man in a dark jacket who shook hands with everyone present and said little until the moment the cup was placed in his hands, when he said something in Spanish that the interpreter beside Cole translated as, "It survived. Everything else is gone, and it survived." He turned it to read the engraving and ran his thumb across the Hebrew letters, and then held it at the angle that caught the room's light in the way that engraved silver catches light, which is to say that it looked briefly like something alive. Cole flew home from Krakow 2 days later and drove from Great Falls Airport directly to the station and stood in the station kitchen and made soup from a can because it was 10 at night, and that was what was available. And he ate it standing at the window and thought about a watchmaker in 1938 and a photograph on a table and the 79 years between that photograph and a great-nephew holding an engraved silver cup in a building in the old Jewish quarter. He thought about the army officer who'd driven one of the trucks, the one who'd known it was wrong. He and Adeline had spent 3 evenings in August trying to find him. It was not easy. The Army Corps convoy records from November 1947 were fragmentary, the relevant documents having been subject to the same classification management that had redacted the 1968 memo, and what remained in the accessible archive was thin. But Adeline had a method, the same one she'd used for 31 years as an archivist, which was to go around the edges of what was missing rather than directly at it. She found a service record, not for the convoy itself, but for the personnel stationed at a Lincoln County Army Corps facility in the autumn of 1947. Cross-referenced with county records from the same period, she produced a list of 8 names. Of those 8, 3 had written letters to relatives in Lincoln County during their posting, letters that had been donated to the county archive by those relatives' estates over the subsequent decades. Of those 3, 1 had written a letter mentioning transportation work in October and November that he couldn't describe in detail, but that he found troubling. The man's name was Earl Hutchins. He had been 24 years old in 1947. He'd grown up in Eureka, which was why his letters had ended up in the Lincoln County Archive. He'd returned to Eureka after his discharge in 1949 and worked as a mechanic for 30 years and been on the Eureka Volunteer Fire Department for 22 of those years and died in 1991 at the age of 68. He had a daughter. Her name was Patricia. She was 61 years old and lived in Kalispell and worked as an office manager for an orthodontic practice. Cole called her on a Tuesday afternoon in September. He told her who he was and what he was working on, and that he'd come across her father's name in connection with the Lake Varrun discovery, and that he wanted to speak with her if she was willing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He talked about it once. Just once, when I was about 16. He'd had a couple of beers, and he got quiet in the way he got when something was sitting on him. And he told me that when he was in the Army he'd been part of moving something he shouldn't have helped move. He said he hadn't known what it was at the time, not exactly, but he'd figured it out afterward. He said it bothered him for a long time." "Did he say what it was?" "He said it was things that belonged to people." She paused, "and that those people weren't going to get them back." Cole sat at the kitchen table with the phone and thought about Earl Hutchins at 24, driving a truck in the dark toward a lake, knowing something was wrong, and being 24 and in the Army, and the wrong thing being above his pay grade, and then living with it for 44 years, and then telling his daughter once, with a couple of beers in him, before going back to not telling anyone. He told Patricia about Daniel in Krakow and the silver cup. He told her about the Amsterdam ceremony and the Paris Monet and the Raphael in Florence. He told her what the total recovery had amounted to. The paintings returned to families and museums, the gold distributed to successor governments, the bonds and currency resolved through international banking mechanisms. She was quiet for a while after he finished. Then she said, "He would have wanted to know that it came back, that someone found it." Cole said he thought that was probably right. She said, "Thank you for calling me. I know you didn't have to." He said he thought he probably did have to, and meant it. The Congressional Subcommittee hearing on cultural property recovery and federal land management took place in Washington in November. Cole was called to testify, which his attorney had prepared him for, and which he had prepared himself for in the way he prepared for everything, by going through the facts in order and making sure he could speak to each one accurately. The subcommittee had 5 members, 2 of whom had clearly read the briefing materials, and 3 of whom had clearly not. The ones who hadn't asked questions that required Cole to explain what a dry suit was, and whether the lake was very deep, which he answered without inflection. The ones who had asked questions that were actually about what they wanted to know, which was how a single ranger in a remote district had discovered something that 11 federal agencies had collectively failed to find for 77 years. Cole thought about that question before answering it. He said, "I walked the same lake for 8 years. I knew what it was supposed to look like, and when it looked different, I didn't decide it was probably nothing." One of the subcommittee members, a woman from Oregon who'd spent 20 years in environmental law before entering Congress, leaned forward. "You submitted a formal assessment request through your supervisor and were told to wait for the standard review period." "That's correct. And you proceeded anyway." "I proceeded with non-dive surface assessment activities that were within my field discretion, yes." The subcommittee member looked at him over her reading glasses with the expression of someone who appreciated precision. "And then you borrowed a dry suit and went in anyway." The hearing room was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. She nodded once and wrote something on her notepad. "I think that's the part of this story that matters most," she said. "Not the paintings, not the gold. The part where someone decided that a 2-degree temperature difference in a patch of ice was worth paying attention to when no one else thought it mattered." Cole thought about Nora saying, "Because you walked the same lake for 8 years and noticed when something changed." He thought about Earl Hutchins driving a truck at 4 in the morning and knowing it was wrong. He thought about Adeline in her back room with her filing cabinet and her magnifying glass and 31 years of keeping track of things that other people had decided weren't worth keeping track of. "Yes," he said, "that's the part that matters most." The subcommittee recommended, in its report published 3 weeks after the hearing, a review of cultural property monitoring protocols for all federally managed land in the United States, with particular attention to remote and infrequently assessed areas. It also recommended a commendation for Cole, which the Department of the Interior issued in December in a letter that used the phrase exemplary field judgment again, and which Cole folded and put in his assessment notebook beside Earl Hutchins's name and Daniel's letter from Buenos Aires. The installation itself presented a question that the Federal Preservation Order had deferred but not answered, which was what to do with the structure once it was empty. The concrete was sound. The chamber walls had held for 77 years of submersion without significant deterioration. The steel door mechanisms, after decades of corrosion, had been replaced by the recovery team with modern equivalents. The options that were discussed included demolition, which would have required drilling and explosive work at depth that the environmental assessment determined was not compatible with the lake's water quality standards. Continued preservation as a historical structure, which would have required ongoing maintenance and oversight. Or sealing, the same solution chosen in 1952, though this time with documentation and without secrets. The final determination, made by the Interior Department in consultation with the Army Corps of Engineers and the Montana State Historic Preservation Office, was to designate the installation as a subsurface historical site under federal protection, to seal the entrance, and to add its location to the National Register of Historic Places under the designation Lincoln County Installation 7. Date of construction 1947. Historical significance. Cold War-era federal storage facility. Site of 2024. Cultural property recovery. It was the most bureaucratic possible ending for the most unlikely possible structure, and it was exactly right. The lake had kept it. The lake would keep it. Nora came back in February for a long weekend, the road clear for once in the way February sometimes allowed. She arrived on Friday evening, and they made dinner together, an activity that had become their custom rather than his. Nora managing the vegetables, and the timing with an organizational efficiency that Cole suspected came from Diane rather than from him. After dinner, she wanted to hear the wolves. He told her it was February and they might not call tonight. That wolves didn't perform on schedules, and she said she understood that, but could they sit outside anyway? They sat on the station porch in their winter gear, Nora in the green jacket with the broken zipper, and Cole in the insulated vest he'd had since his first winter at the station. The temperature was -8, which was cold enough to be serious and manageable enough not to be dangerous. Stars were out in the quantity that existed only above 6,000 feet in winter, the kind of sky that city people saw in photographs and thought was enhanced. They sat for 20 minutes without the wolves. Nora was patient in a way that 9-year-olds occasionally surprised adults by being, the patience coming from genuine willingness to wait rather than from suppressing the desire to move. Cole had noticed this in her over the past year, a deepening of a quality she'd always had, the capacity to be still when stillness was what a situation required. She said, without moving or looking away from the treeline, "Did you know that the Uffizi gets 4 million visitors a year?" He said he hadn't known the specific number. So the Raphael, when it goes on display, for million people a year might see it. She paused. That's 4 million people looking at something that was locked in the dark for 80 years. Cole looked at the treeline. "Yeah," she said, "I've been thinking about that. About how things that are hidden are still there. They don't stop being what they are just because nobody can see them." He thought about the ice. About a February lake in 1947, the water rising slowly over years and decades toward a structure built too close to the shoreline by men who hadn't imagined the forest recovering enough to shift the water table. About the darkness inside the chamber, the specific quality of sealed darkness where nothing changed because nothing could. "That's exactly right," he said. The wolves started at 9:47. 2 of them from the eastern ridge, the sound coming down the slope and across the station clearing in the cold air, clean and carrying. Nora went very still beside him. He watched her face in his peripheral vision, the way it changed when the sound reached her, the expression of someone encountering something larger than they'd prepared for. The wolves called for 3 minutes, then stopped. The silence after was different from the silence before. Nora let out a breath. "They're so much bigger than the videos," she said. He thought about what she'd told him about the howling. The loud thing is for when they're far apart. They sat on the porch for another 10 minutes without speaking, and the cold came down off the ridge in slow waves, and the stars were everywhere, and the lake was out there in the dark doing what it had always done, which was hold things. She said finally, "Daddy, I want to start. Learning next summer. The diving." He looked at her. "We'll find a certified course in Kalispell. You have to be 10 to start the junior open water certification." She calculated. "I'll be 10 in April." He said, "I know." She said, "Good," and went inside to get hot chocolate. And the door closed behind her with the sound of a warm house in winter, and Cole sat on the porch for another minute by himself and looked at the dark where the treeline was and thought about all the things in the world that were still there even when no one could see them, waiting for someone patient enough to notice that something was different. He thought about a pressure crack running 18 feet southeast, about a palm pressed flat against ice that was 2 degrees warmer than it should be, about a depth gauge reading 28 feet and a light beam finding something that had no business being there. He thought about Nora turning 10 in April. He went inside. The lake would still be there in the morning. It always was. Danny Serrano drove up from Kalispell the week after the federal preservation order was filed, without being asked. He showed up at the station on a Saturday morning with a thermos of coffee and the particular manner of someone who'd been waiting for a reason to come and had finally been given one. Cole found him on the porch, looking out at the tree line with his hands in his jacket pockets. He said, "You actually went in." Cole said, "I told you I was going to." Danny shook his head slowly, not with judgment, with the expression of someone recalibrating their model of the world. He'd been a ranger for 16 years, and in that time had conducted 11 winter dive operations, all of them authorized, all of them documented, all of them in lakes that had been assessed and flagged and reviewed through every protocol that existed. He understood the difference between what Cole had done and what was permitted, and he also understood something that the regional office's complaint had not accounted for, which was that the protocols existed to protect the work, and sometimes protecting the work meant doing it before the protocols could stop you. He stayed for the weekend. They walked 3 of Cole's 11 lakes on Saturday, Danny asking questions about the assessment methodology Cole had developed over 8 years, the way he read ice color and thermal variation and pressure distribution. Cole answered without simplifying, because Danny didn't need things simplified. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. On Sunday morning, Danny said, "I've been thinking about the other lakes." Cole looked at him. "Not just yours. All the lakes in the district. All the lakes in every district. If Installation 7 existed and nobody knew it was there, it's worth asking whether there are other installations, other structures, other things that someone built near a shoreline in 1947 and that the water eventually took." Cole thought about what Dr. Tran had said about Recovery Operation Atlas being one of several networks operating in the post-war period. About the 6 installations documented in Lincoln County, of which 5 had been officially decommissioned and 1 had been sealed and deferred. He thought about the specific phrase in the 1968 memo, pending a determination of legal jurisdiction. That kind of language, he said slowly, usually appeared in documents when the same problem existed in more than one place. Danny looked at the lake. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I thought too." Danny went back to Kalispell and wrote a formal proposal to the regional director recommending a systematic review of thermal variation data across all lakes in the Kootenai and Flathead National Forests, specifically in areas where mid-20th century federal infrastructure projects had been documented within 2 miles of water. The proposal cited Cole's methodology in detail and requested authorization for a 3-year assessment program. The regional director approved it in 6 weeks, which was faster than anything Cole had submitted in 8 years. He called Danny when he heard and said so. Danny said, "You softened the ground." Cole said, "I think the $480 million discovery softened the ground." Danny said, "Same thing." Margaret Solis had not taken cases like the Lake Varrun situation since leaving the Interior Department's Inspector General's office in 2011. She'd spent the intervening years doing consulting work on land disputes and historical property questions, the kind of cases that required research and patience and the willingness to read documents and archives that no one else had thought to request. She was good at it, and she charged enough to live comfortably, and she did not miss the federal government's internal politics, which had been the primary reason she'd left. She took Cole's case for a reason she didn't explain until the October after the recovery operation concluded. She told him over the phone, during one of the calls that had become irregular but persistent after the formal investigation wound down. "My grandmother," she said, "was a displaced person. She came from a village in Poland that no longer exists. She brought almost nothing when she left because there was almost nothing left to bring. But she talked her whole life about a painting that had hung in her family's house, something her father had bought in Warsaw before the war. She described it in detail. She described the colors and the subject and the way the light hit it in the afternoon. She never found out what happened to it." Cole said nothing. Margaret said, "When you described what was in those cases to me, I thought of my grandmother. I thought about the possibility that something like what she described was in one of those rooms. I looked, after the recovery operation documented everything. The painting she described doesn't appear in the catalog. It wasn't there, or it wasn't there with enough documentation to identify it, or it didn't survive." She paused. "But something else was there. A lot of something else's. And the families of those something else's got them back." Cole said, "Is that enough?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "It's what there is. And yes, it's enough." The media attention had arrived in waves, each one larger than the last, and Cole had not been prepared for any of them. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The first wave came when the preservation order was filed and the basic facts of the discovery became available through public records requests. A reporter from the Associated Press wrote a piece that described the installation and its contents in general terms, and that piece was picked up by 47 publications in 11 countries within 72 hours. Cole gave no interviews during this period, on the advice of Dr. Tran, whose reasoning was that speaking publicly before the authentication and legal processes were resolved would give the Veritas Trust's lawyers material to work with. The second wave came when the Veritas Trust's claim collapsed and the international repatriation process began. This wave was larger and louder and included television, which Cole found more disorienting than print because television required him to be present in a way that field assessment work had not prepared him for. He gave 3 interviews, all of them structured around the facts rather than his personal experience. And in all 3, the interviewer eventually asked the same question in slightly different forms, which was how he had felt when he first understood what he'd found. He gave the same answer each time. He said he'd felt the specific discomfort of someone who has found something important and doesn't yet know who it belongs to or what it requires of them. That the discovery itself was the easy part. The ice told him something was there. The question of what to do about it was what he'd had to figure out on his own. One interviewer pressed further and asked whether he'd been frightened by the opposition, by the 202 number and the search station and the threat messages. He thought about that. He said yes, but that frightened was different from deterred, and that the difference between those 2 things was probably the whole story. The 3rd wave was the largest and the most prolonged, arriving when the full authentication results were published and the aggregate value of the recovery became public. This wave brought people to Eureka and to the lake access road in numbers that the Forest Service had not planned for, and Cole spent 2 weeks in the spring coordinating with visitor management staff to establish viewing protocols for the lake's southern shore, where people stood in good weather with their phones and photographed the open water that now sat above an empty chamber. He found this last part the strangest. People were photographing a lake because of what it no longer contained. The absence had become the attraction. He mentioned this to Adeline when he stopped by her shop in early June. She sold more maps that spring than she'd sold in the previous 3 years combined, primarily topographical maps of the lake and surrounding area. She had ordered additional stock twice and was considering a 3rd order with equanimity because Adeline had been in Eureka long enough to have seen several things become briefly famous, and she understood that attention was a season rather than a permanent condition. She said, "People come to see where things were hidden. What they're actually looking for is the feeling that something can still be found, that the world still contains undiscovered things worth caring about." Cole bought a coffee and sat in her back room and thought about that, about what drew people to any place where something had been kept and then revealed. He said, "Do you think there are other things? Like what we found? Out there somewhere?" She looked at him over her cup. Without question, he thought about Danny's proposal, about thermal variation data and mid-20th century federal infrastructure and lakes that hadn't been asked the right questions. There was a morning in late September when Cole walked the western section alone, before sunrise, the way he had on the morning of the first discovery 2 years earlier. The ice was forming again at the edges, the first thin sheet that would thicken through October and November until the lake was fully sealed by January. The orange marker was still in place. The Federal Historic Preservation designation had made it, technically, a navigational marker for the designated site below, which meant it had a bureaucratic reason to stay that it hadn't had before. He stood at the marker in the September dark and listened to the lake. There was a sound in October ice that didn't exist in January ice. A lighter register, thinner and more tentative, the sound of something in the early stages of becoming what it would later be. January ice was certain of itself. October ice was still deciding. He pulled out his notebook and uncapped his pen and wrote the date and the temperature and the current ice thickness at the marker, 3/4 of an inch, forming. Then he wrote one additional line that wasn't part of any standard assessment form. Year 2. Same lake. Same work. Different world. He capped the pen and stood there until the sun came over the eastern ridge and hit the water that was still open at the lake's center, turning it briefly the color of something valuable. And then it moved past that angle and the lake became ordinary again, which was fine. Ordinary was what it was between discoveries. And between discoveries was where the work happened, the slow, patient accumulation of attention that made discovery possible when the moment arrived. He walked back toward the shore. The ice cracked once beneath his right boot and came back from the eastern ridge changed, the way sound on this lake always did, carrying something extra in the return that hadn't been there when it left. He stopped and listened. Then he kept walking. Gerald Foss retired in March, 14 months after the preservation order was filed. He didn't announce it widely. A notice went up on the district board on a Wednesday, and his last day was the following Friday. And between those 2 dates, he continued doing exactly what he'd always done, which was managing 14 years of institutional knowledge in a way that made it look like routine. Cole found out from Patricia Fenn, who mentioned it during a scheduling call. He drove to the district office on Friday afternoon, arriving at 4:30 without having planned what he would say. Foss was alone in his office packing a box. Not a large box. 14 years had produced a modest physical accumulation, 2 framed photographs, a topographical survey of the district from 1989, a coffee mug that said National Forest Service on the side in letters worn soft from use. He looked up when Cole appeared in the doorway. He didn't look surprised. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Cole said, I didn't know until Wednesday. Foss set the mug in the box. Time, he said. Simple as that. They stood for a moment in the specific quiet of offices being vacated, the particular emptiness that appeared when a space began forgetting its occupant. Cole said, the letter you submitted. To the regional director. Defending the field assessment activity. Foss looked at him. You read it. Patricia showed me a copy. Foss picked up one of the framed photographs and looked at it before placing it in the box. It was a photograph of the district taken from altitude, the kind that made 11 lakes look like scattered coins. What I wrote was accurate, he said. You had professional discretion and you used it. That's not complicated. You didn't have to put it in writing. No, Foss said. I didn't. He closed the box flaps, pressing them flat with the methodical care he applied to everything. But the complaint against you was filed in writing. Accusations accumulate if nothing opposes them. He looked at Cole. I've managed this district for 14 years. I know the difference between a ranger who causes problems and a ranger who finds them. You find them. That's the job. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Cole said, thank you. Foss picked up the box. He walked to the door, and Cole stepped aside, and they stood briefly in the hallway the way people stood when a thing was finished and the words for it hadn't arrived yet. Foss said, walk your lakes, Cole. All 11 of them. Even the ones that look like nothing. Then he walked down the hallway and out through the main door, and that was that. Cole stood in the empty office for a moment. The bare desk. The pale rectangles on the wall where the frames had hung. The window looking east toward a ridge he'd seen from this angle 100 times without paying attention to it. He paid attention to it now. Then he drove back to the station, because the work was there, and the work was what remained when everything else resolved itself. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.